pure horror. It began as an easy plan on a Thursday afternoon, a fast message thread among 5 friends who had not seen the stars together since college. The idea sounded clean and healthy. 2 nights in the Allegheny National Forest, a site near Kinsua Creek, a little fire, a lot of silence. Then home by Sunday evening with that clear air feeling in the lungs. Nolan booked the permit number by phone, Brooke double-checked the maps, June promised a new camp stove, Priya handled food, and Malik tossed in a first aid kit heavy enough to impress a wilderness guide. Everyone liked the balance of skills and the promise of a lake nearby. Everyone wanted quiet. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? They met in Warren just before sunrise on Friday, parking under a faded light outside a diner where the coffee smelled like burnt sugar. The temperature felt crisp, cold enough to fog breath, warm enough to go without gloves. They ate in a booth that rattled when trucks rolled past. The waitress kept calling the group early birds, and the nickname stuck through the morning like a charm. At 7, the town was behind them, the radio lost signal, and the forest swallowed the road. Pines rose in tight ranks as the asphalt dwindled into dirt and the sky thinned into pale silver between branches. They drove the last hour with windows cracked for the pine smell and the sound of gravel under the tires. At 9:40, they turned off onto a narrow logging spur, followed a faded arrow marker, and bumped through standing puddles until a small clearing opened before them. The creek curved around the site like a black ribbon. A mossy boulder stood at the far edge, and birch trees leaned together as if always whispering. The place felt private and older than the dirt road. It felt like a room that had not been used for a long time and yet kept neat. They stepped out, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. Boots scraping, a car door shutting, the zip of canvas. The morning went smoothly, the tents went up facing the water, the lines were tight, the flies clipped down. Priya found a flat place for the cooler. June assembled the stove and made eggs that tasted like smoke and butter. Malik stacked firewood and showed everyone a trick for dry shavings. Nolan strung a blue cord between 2 trees and hung a lantern for later. The sun climbed, a gentle, warm circle above branches. The creek moved without talking. It was the kind of peace people pay for in a city. That early to midday stretch tasted like a promise kept. Around 2, a lone pickup rolled past on the logging road and paused at the clearing entrance. The driver kept the engine idling while he looked at the group. He wore a cap, tugged low, and his profile was angular and sun-emptied. He lifted 2 fingers from the wheel in a small salute, then drove on. The moment was ordinary enough, yet the engine note lingered in the trees long after the truck was gone. Priya laughed and said the man probably knew a better spot. Nolan said all the best spots were secret. Brooke checked the map again and traced a line from the creek to the lakeshore about a quarter-mile north. She wanted to stretch her legs before dinner, and everyone agreed the light would be perfect by 4. They started that walk at 3:52. Each with a bottle of water, the trail a faint seam in leaves and needles. The forest smelled darker there, less like pine and more like a cellar. They found the lake in a shallow bowl, the surface still and metallic, catching clouds like dull coins. A thin mist drifted and peeled. In the mud near the waterline, there were shapes, not boot tread. The marks looked long and narrow, with a little crescent at the front. June crouched and pointed. Maybe deer, maybe not. The spacing felt wrong. The stride felt too careful. Priya said it looked like someone dragged a canoe. Brooke said it looked like someone crawled out, and then she laughed because that sounded like the opening line of a bad story told around a fire. Malik took a photo and tucked the worry away, the way people tuck in a shirt they plan to change later. They got back at 5:10. The clearing had changed only by feel. The light had a lower copper tilt, and the shadows had pulled together in the corners of the trees as if the woods were exhaling. They built the fire, and there was a calm, serious joy in the way flame threads rose and caught. Dinner was simple: a skillet of peppers and sausage, a pot of beans, a second pot for water. At 6:30, the fire crackled white and orange. At 7, the birds went softer. At 7:38, the cold steepened, and they put on hats. By 8, the stars switched on in sudden scattered clusters. Everything felt earned. The talk turned to old classes, to cheap apartments, to late-night walks on sidewalks far from this place. Someone joked that if a forest wanted to scare city kids, it would only need to wait until the fire burned low. Everyone laughed, and the laughter sounded warm and full, and the woods held it like a cup. At 9:50, the first odd sound rolled across the water. A single hard splash, not a fish flick, not a rock drop. A heavy body entering with weight. It came from the north side, from the shallow bowl where they had stood in the afternoon. No one moved at first. The fire hissed. Then a second splash, closer. Malik stood and lifted his headlamp. The beam found mist, nothing else. A third splash, farther to the left now, like something changed lanes. Nolan joked that it was a beaver and that beavers worked night shifts. Brooke said beavers do not move like that. Jun said the echo might be odd over still water. Priya said they should save the last of the dry wood because the damp sticks would smoke. At 10:12, a soft whistling drifted through the trees beyond the road. Not a song, not wind and grass. Just 3 notes, rising and falling in a way that felt too deliberate to be shaped by air. It did not sound near or far. It sounded like the woods were carrying it on a shoulder and setting it down among them. The fire snapped, and the 5 looked at each other. No one smiled this time. Nolan said it was probably a hunter walking out late. Malik said night hiking could be dangerous and that nobody whistles at night in a place like this. June sat closer to the fire and wrapped his hands around his knees. Priya tossed a new stick to the flames and said they should call it a night as soon as the water boiled. Brooke checked her watch and said 10:20 is a normal time to get into sleeping bags. The plan felt good because it was a plan. They bedded down at 10:49. The fire was a red bowl. The lantern swung a little in a draft and made the trees look like they moved without moving. The zip of tent doors felt too loud. Nolan and Brooke in one tent. Priya alone in the small green dome she always used. June and Malik sharing a bigger one. The night poured over everything at once, thick and cool. At 11:30, the forest settled into that heavy quiet that makes even a breath sound like a stone thrown into a lake. At 12:07, Nolan woke because the hair on his arms lifted. He heard footfalls not on the road and not on the trail, but on the soft edge of the clearing. Slow, measured, steady, like someone circling to count tents. He held his breath and felt his chest sting. Brooke lay still. The steps past his door, faded, returned on the other side. He whispered that it was probably a deer. He stopped speaking because a pale oval moved across the tent wall, as if a face passed inches away. There was no outline of a nose, there were no eyes, just a smooth stain of lighter dark sliding by. He pressed his teeth together and did not move again. At 12:40, Malik heard it too. The steps were careful and almost patient. They stopped, then a soft dragging sound, then steps again. He touched June on the shoulder, and June nodded without opening his eyes. At 1:03, the whistling returned. The same 3 notes, now shaped like a call and answer. One set from the road, one from the creek, one from the black line of trees beyond the fire ring. Priya sat up in her tent and placed her palms on the floor like she could feel the vibration. She whispered her own name as if to hold herself inside it. The notes fell quiet. Her heart did not. At 1:30, a cry lilted across the clearing, a voice that sounded soaked, thin, and cold. It asked for help without forming a real request. It carried the shape of a plea without words. It sounded like a person, and also like a tape someone had warped. Nolan unzipped an inch of the tent and looked out. Nothing but mist and a darker dark, where the creek pooled. Malik unzipped as well, and his headlamp clipped the edge of a birch. The bark looked wet like a shed skin. No eyes glowed. No bodies fled. The cry came again. From the road this time, then from the lake, then from behind his tent. The distance felt wrong each time, like it measured something that was not space. At 2, they gathered by the ember bowl of the fire and fed it just enough to make light. No one said much, breath plumed white, the lantern hummed, the whistling settled into the low trees and paced them. Brooke gripped the handle of the camp hatchet without swinging it. Priya held a long flashlight with both hands like it could double as a baton. June stood with one boot half unlaced. Malik took a deep breath and called out that they did not want trouble. The syllables fell down right where he stood, like they had weight. Nothing answered. The water shifted. The mist leaned across the ground like a fog tide. By 3, the sound slowed, as if whatever moved had lost interest. The friends returned to their tents with the brittle pride of people who had endured something and could now insist it was nothing. Sleep came in frightened scraps. When the first bleached version of sunrise slid under the treetops at 5:56, the relief tasted like clean water. They made coffee the way survivors make coffee, hands shaking, laughter a notch too loud. Daylight pushed the night backward into the tree line. It felt like being forgiven. Then they found the prints. By 7:10, the light was strong enough to peel mist off the lake, and there in the gray sand lay a sequence of marks that did not fit anything they knew. Long impressions, narrow at the front, widening mid-length, with faint lines that curved like ridges. They ran from the water to the tree line and back again. The stride was long. The path was an arc that circled the clearing twice. At one point, the marks crossed themselves in a way that suggested something had paused, crouched, and then stood. Malik measured one with his hand and said the length ran from thumb to elbow. June squinted and said it looked like something with webbed hands had walked on its fingers. Brooke said that was not how animals move. Priya said this was a bad idea made real and that they needed to leave. The vote came fast. Pack, drive out, breakfast on the road. They started at 7:31, trying to move calmly while moving fast. The tents came down in practice motions, yet the air felt wrong, as if the clearing were holding its breath. Malik reached for the lantern rope, and a wind that did not touch any leaves pushed across his neck. Nolan turned toward the creek and saw circles of ripples building where nothing had broken the surface. Brooke cinched the last strap on her pack and whispered that she could feel pressure in her ears. Priya tried her car first. The engine turned once and stopped. She tried again. Nothing but a heavy click. Jun tried his. Same click. Malik tried his. Dead. At 8:19, the whistling began again. Softer now, farther away, like the woods were practicing. Then the notes changed, lowering as if someone were walking toward a deeper room. Nolan grabbed the hatchet. Malik took the heavy flashlight. They agreed to walk the road south until they found a ridge with a phone signal. Brooke and Priya would stay with the gear and try to coax power from the portable battery. June would check the fuses. They drew a line of logic, like chalk, bright and hopeful. The south road ran along the creek and then cut up. After 10 minutes, the trees closed in and the air cooled by several degrees. At 8:49, they found the first of the old timber signs nailed to a trunk. The letters were gouged and faded. The words said no overnight use. The one below said day use only. The one below that said water level unstable. It felt like a warning whispered after the door already shut. Nolan said they did not stay by the lake, and Malik said the creek connects to the lake anyway, and that water does not respect little sign. The whistling drifted again, but now it came from ahead and behind at the same time. Nolan slowed. Malik said they should mark the trail. He tied a red bandana to a low branch and felt stupid doing it, then felt worse for not doing it sooner. At 9:12, the smell changed. Less pine, more iron. They crested a rise and saw the old iron bridge that crossed the creek where the water narrowed. The deck was banged up and patched with plywood. On the near side, something had scratched the railing with the head of a nail. Rows of tall, thin marks, grouped in threes, dragging down to the ground like someone had been bored and patient at the same time. They walked past slowly. The bridge hummed under their weight. The creek moved under them in black sliding planes. Aliquot waves licked the stones. Mid-span, Nolan looked down and saw his own face bent by the water. And then beside it, another pale oval drifting up from deeper than a person could stand. He stepped back too fast. His heel clanged against the rail, and the sound went into the trees like a thrown coin. They made it to the ridge at 9:48 and found a bar of service on Malik's phone. He dialed the ranger station number Brooke had written on a torn map corner. It rang twice and cut out. He tried again. A voicemail webbed across the line, the words too slow. He asked for help at Kinzua Creek and said they could not get their vehicles to start. He gave the coordinates the way his hand would give away secrets when it shook. Then he held the phone in the air as if that could push the message forward. He hit send. The screen blinked. The bar of service disappeared like a boy learning a magic trick. After that, the phone refused to light. They returned at 10:30, moving faster now. The clearing looked exactly the same and entirely different. The gear lay where they left it, but the cooler lid was open, though the latch was engaged. A line of wet silt lay across the ground in a curve like a resting body had left its outline. Brooke and Priya stood by the dead cars with their hands pressed flat against the hoods as if listening. June knelt by a battery with the case open and a set of fuses fanned on the ground like cards. Priya said the walk had taken too long. Brooke said a log had knocked against the stones and made them both jump. Her voice had that higher edge people carry when they have crossed from fear into the bright space where fear feels useful. Malik said the call might have gone through. The words felt weak while still true. They tried to eat at 11 because eating proves a day is normal. The food tasted like something stored in a basement that does not want to be a home. The forest had that noon silence that falls heavy on thin places. At 1, the sky turned white and then deeper gray. Nolan sharpened the hatchet with small strokes because motion felt better than stillness. Priya laid out the map and traced a route that would cut across to an old service road by late afternoon. Brooke argued they should not split again. June whispered that he could hear water under the ground as if the creek was also above them. Malik said everyone would stay together if they walked, and the rule felt like a rope. At 2, the light began to behave like late day. It was not late day. It only looked like it. Clouds slid in without wind. The whistling did not come back. The relief made them feel bold in the wrong way. They decided to move. Backpacks on, lantern stuffed into the top of a bag, a single car key in each pocket because superstition sometimes gets promoted to policy. They stepped onto the trail at 2:20 and felt that strange tilt of land found in old saloons and strange hallways. The forest was not flat. The forest was not honest either. They did not make it to the service road. At 3, the trail vanished without warning in a stand of young pines. The needle floor pressed smooth like a swept church. They spread out to find the worn line again, calling names in low voices. Malik called for Priya and heard his voice return from the right, though he had spoken to the left. Nolan called for Brooke and heard the name slide away as if the trees were carrying it. June said he saw the blue flash of the lantern cord. He did not. He saw a strip of something bright hanging from a lower branch, and when he reached it, he found his own red bandana tied tight, smelling faintly of his pocket and something muddy. They had looped back without a corner in the path. At 3:30, they were in the clearing again, though. None of them had turned their bodies. It was as if the clearing had stepped forward to greet them. The fire ring sat black and clean. The cars hunched. The lake beyond the trees lifted mist that now lay across the ground in thin belts. Brooke started to cry and did not apologize. Malik pressed his palms to his eyes and counted to 10. Nolan said they would make a bigger fire before dark, and the work would keep their minds steady. Priya sat on her pack and listened for the whistling. The silence was worse. They built the tallest legal fire and then built it taller. At 5:10, flames jumped high enough to paint the birch trunks gold. At 5:40, something moved in that painted world at the edge of the light. Not a person, not a deer. Tall and thin as a drawn line, it shifted between 2 trees and seemed to bend when it did not bend. The shape stopped, then a second shape crossed behind it in the other direction. Nolan went still in a way that makes animals forget there is meat in you. June whispered that if they made noise, it might announce them. Brooke whispered that silence had already done that job. At 6, the crying came back. That same soaked and thin sound. It asked for help from the road, then from the creek, then from beside the lantern rope. They stood together because loneliness would have ended them. The fire felt like a fragile wall. The voices drew close, then stopped, as if testing their own boundaries. Malik lifted the heavy flashlight and said with complete calm that they would hold this line until dawn. He said it loudly enough to convince his own nerves that they could obey him. At 7, the mist thickened. It rose from the creek and slid along the ground at knee height, seeping into the clearing rather than blowing in. It smelled like coins and old wood. The firelight turned it into a living thing. The shapes at the edge of the trees stepped nearer, then paused, then nearer again. Nolan saw one limb bend the wrong way like a hinge on the outside of a door. Priya pressed her back against Malik and kept the beam of her light at waist level because the space above the waist felt like an invitation. June put another log on the fire and said the fuel would run out by 11 if they fed it at this rate. Brooke said 11 was a number that felt very far away and that they would find a way to stretch the pile like poor people stretch soup. At 8:19, the first voice behind them spoke. It said Nolan in a perfect copy of Brooke's cadence, but Brooke was standing in front of him holding the hatchet. He kept his face still. It said Malik in a ribbon of Priya's voice, but Priya did not open her mouth. It said June with the soft laugh Malik used on lucky days. The edge of the clearing seemed to press in with each name, as if a roll call might replace a boundary. The fire popped and threw an ember that died before it landed. The dark became a muscle. Then the water erupted. A heavy strike on the lake surface, then another, like bodies leaping and falling and leaping again. The sound hammered at the air and drove birds from trees they had not seen. The friends did not turn. They held the circle like a small city. The splashing stopped, as if it had only wanted to prove that it could become louder whenever it liked. At 9, the lantern burned steady. The fire had slumped and revived and slumped again. The gear near the cars had taken on a glitter of damp. On the ground by the cooler lay a track like the ones at the lake, except deeper, except smeared with silt, pushed up in a thin fringe like gills. Nolan knew that if he followed that mark with his eyes, it would lead out of the clearing toward the creek, and he knew that if he looked up, he would see something looking back from that place. So he did not look up. He looked at the base of the birch instead and counted the curls in the bark. 1, 2, 3. He discovered that counting does not work on fear when the numbers have nothing to hold. At 10:11, the whistling bloomed again, and it was inside the clearing now. It came from the line where their boots stood. It came from the space under the folding table. It came from the thin place between two logs. Each time it rose, their minds tried to place a mouth under it and failed. Priya began to pray in a way that had no words. Malik placed the flashlight on the ground and rested his hand on the top as if it were a sleeping dog. June whispered that the battery was getting warm, and that meant nothing, he understood. Brooke steadied the hatchet against her leg and told the space in front of her that it was not welcome. Her voice did not shake. That mattered. At 11, the woodpile turned small. The sky above the mist had that black depth that looks like it can fold down and make a new ceiling over everything. The shapes at the edge of the clearing had grown more confident. They leaned against the light and let it reveal them wrong, limbs too long, heads without the geometry of a face. Sometimes a flat white oval hung where the idea of a face should go. The oval turned and turned like a coin on a table. Occasionally, a mouth appeared and stretched in a grin that did not reach any eyes, and then slid away as if the skin did not know how to hold it. At 11:42, something stepped into the clearing. Not far, just one step over the line where the mist met the firelight. It bent a little like a person considering how they might walk in an unfamiliar room. It lifted an arm that had an extra hinge. It held a shape at the end of that arm. It was a glove, Priya's glove, the one she had dropped near the cooler at noon. The thing let the glove fall. It listened to it fall. Then it retreated in one precise movement as if the glove had been enough to say a word. Midnight arrived without being announced. The night air had a physical weight. Each of them had made a small private promise in their head, and none of those promises sounded sane. Then a new sound climbed out of the trees. Footsteps, but not on the ground. Footsteps on wood. a slow, heavy rhythm, like someone climbing a set of stairs that did not exist. The sound moved down, and then down again, and then down once more. It came to rest at a place where there was no place. The whistling followed, 3 notes, lower than before, shaped like a door opening. The wind huffed once and died. Somewhere in the dark, in water they could not see, a bubble rose and burst with a small wet pop like a tiny hand breaking the surface. Nolan said they had to break the pattern. His voice sounded older. He said the clearing was running them in circles. He walked to the lantern rope and pulled it down. He untied the lantern and hooked it to the belt of his jacket. He told the others they would walk not by the road, not by the trail, but straight line toward the ridge, past the iron bridge, no turns, no looking back, fire in view until it could not be kept in view. He was gambling on motion. He was betting his body on a compass no one could hold. They agreed because sometimes agreeing is survival. They left at 12:14, the lantern a floating sun on his hip, the fire throwing long petal shadows behind them. The mist slid over their boots like little waves. The whistling swelled with the first 10 steps and then thinned, as if it did not like them moving together. The trees arranged themselves into lanes. The trunks looked like pillars in an old building. For 20 minutes, the plan worked. The clearing did not return. The ridgeline grew as a blacker dark lifting above the usual dark. The creak noise sharpened and became directional. The group saw the sheen of the iron bridge rails through the trees. Then the lantern dimmed. Not a slow loss, a single stutter and then a new weak yellow. Nolan jostled it with his elbow. The light flared and then thinned again. Malik said they should stop to fix it. Nolan said no. Brooke said keep going because stopping had become a kind of consent. Priya began counting steps again and made it to 213. June said the air by the bridge tasted metallic. They stepped onto the deck and the wood spoke in deep chords. The creek rushed and the sound was a relief. Water that moved with purpose felt honest. Halfway across, the light failed completely. They stood in a dark so full it felt granular. The whistling started up from below the bridge, low, patient, rising with the water spray. The 3 notes repeated until repetition became a shape. Jun lifted his phone, and the screen glowed faintly from stored charge. In that smeared blue rectangle, they saw the outline of something climbing the far railing. Long, narrow, the hands finding grip where there was no grip. It moved with a certain care that said it had learned to move this way. It reached the top and unfolded. Its head turned toward the group, not with curiosity, but with the slow attention a creature uses when its hunger is old and ritual. It held something at the end of one arm, a strip of cloth, red. Jun's bandana. They ran. They did not argue first. They did not urge each other. They moved because all the stories in their muscles told them to move. The deck thudded, the whistling climbed and became very loud. The shape did not chase with speed. It only took steps that were too long and too smooth. Nolan felt breath at the back of his neck, though nothing touched him. Malik kept his hand on Priya's shoulder to keep them together. Brooke held the hatchet low, like a weight that could keep her on the path. Jun kept the phone lit and cried without sound. They made it to the other side and into the trees. The phone light flickered. The lantern gave one last weak glow like a wounded star and then died. The forest closed in again with that polite cruelty that looks like grace. The whistling fell behind, returned ahead, fell behind again, as if the woods breathed it. The group slowed because their bodies forced it. At 12:58, they stepped into a space that their brains recognized a split second before their eyes. The clearing. The cars. The fire collapsed into a black ring, the mist heavy as a blanket. They had run the shape the woods wanted. What came after belongs to the night more than to any language. There was motion at the edge of vision like fish under ice. There were names spoken in voices that existed and did not. There was the creak of wet woods somewhere overhead. There was the first pale smear of dawn at 5:31 that lifted the mist like a stagehand pulling a scrim. And there was the final splashing at the lake, heavy and rude, like a door slamming on a house you never entered. When sunlight finally touched the tops of the birches, the clearing became a normal patch of ground. It wore the morning like a disguise. A fisherman found Nolan on a dirt spur at 7:20, walking without direction with the lantern still tied to his belt. His jacket was wet to the ribs, and his lip had a split the size of a seed. He said very little on the ride into town. He said the cars would not start. He said his friends were packing. He said the woods had too many steps in it. Later, when a deputy asked him what he meant by too many steps, and he stared at the floor and said that on the second night he had counted 6 sets of footfalls when there should have been 5. And then he had counted 7, and then he had realized he could not tell whether any belonged to them anymore. He did not add more. When the search party reached the clearing that afternoon, the site looked tidy. The tents had been neatly struck, the fire ring was clean and cold. On the sand by the lake lay a set of prints that ran from water to trees and then back again. Long, narrow. With the faint suggestion of webbing near the front, no boot tread overlapped them. A glove lay near the cooler and held the blade of the camp hatchet inside it, as if a child had dressed the tool. In a birch branch at the clearing edge hung a red bandana tied in a square knot that none of the friends knew how to tie. The deputy touched it with a pencil and let it hang. The cars both started with a single turn of the key. The battery cables were snug, the fuses sat where they belonged, the radios worked. The ranger who stood near the road and listened to the creak said that sometimes a strong thermal layer will play tricks on sound. He said it the way a man says a prayer when he has lost the words of the prayer and must make new ones. A volunteer tried to laugh. No one joined. As for Malik, for Priya, for Brooke, for Jun, no one found them that weekend. Not the next one either. The search widened and then grew perfunctory and then stopped. Nolan left the county and never returned. He does not like bridges now. He does not like the sound of 3 notes whistled in a kitchen or a parking lot. He does not like a phone signal that fades during the first part of a sentence and returns during the last. He does not like the smell of coins. When the subject of camping comes up, he says there are places where silence is not empty. He says some lakes keep their own time and that the clocks humans bring with them mean nothing there. Drivers on the logging road report harmless things. A mist that hugs the ground even on warm days. A splash heard when the lake lies flat. A thin voice that sounds like a friend calling from a little way off that stops as soon as anyone answers. People are good at ignoring. People will say it is the wind. People will say it is the highway far off. People will say it is a beaver. On some nights, near the end of the long quiet, when the sky has that dark that feels like the last page of a note, a soft whistling moves between the birches. 3 notes, then 3 again. The sound circles once as if counting. It waits. It circles again. It waits longer. It does this until the first bird speaks. The sound does not travel uphill. The sound stays low to the ground where the mist lies. The sound is not for the high things. A simple camping trip turned into pure horror. That is the line a person gives a stranger at a bar to avoid the real version. The real version is this. The woods can learn your names and give them back to you with a shape you do not want to hear. The water can remember when you are alone, even if your friends stand so close their sleeves touch yours. The night can walk around your camp with borrowed legs. And when morning arrives, it can leave just enough behind to make a human mind choose to explain instead of run. If you go, and you will, because some people always go, take fire that does not depend on batteries. Tie your rope where you can see it from the corner of your eye. Refuse to answer when a voice uses your own voice to call you. Listen closely at 12:07 because that hour loves first steps. If you hear 3 notes, do not whistle back. If you see prints that do not line up with anything you know, do not take a picture like a tourist. Keep your eyes on the bark. Count only what you can hold. And when the lake is still as metal and every tree has leaned together to watch, remember that there are nights when staying is a kind of consent. Remember that water has its own doors. Remember that some places are patient. Remember that the woods around Kinswood Creek have all the time in the world. A discovery so strange, even police refused to explain. By the time the Friday night lights flickered off at Millfield High, the air had already turned glassy and cold. You could see your breath drift and vanish over the parking lot, slow and ghost-like, as people shuffled toward their cars. It was late October, a little past 10:40 p.m., and somewhere beyond the last row of houses, the black line of the woods rose like a wall. Locals called that stretch Blackwood Pines. Most cut a wide circle around it after dark. A few swore they heard things moving in there when the wind died. Not animals, not people, just movement. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Two students made the mistake of taking the trail anyway. They had done it before. A shortcut from the field to the duplexes along Wilson Street. They were laughing at first, jackets zipped to their chins, footsteps crunching through frost and leaves. One kept glancing at his phone, the screen lighting his face. The other was listening for owls. He said the silence felt wrong. No crickets, no distant highway, just their breathing and the whisper of pine needles. They saw the light. At 10:52 p.m., according to the first frantic call to 911. It was not a flashlight, not a fire. The glow came from the ground itself, a low blue pulse that made the damp leaves look like glass. It flickered with a slow heartbeat, brightened, dimmed, and brightened again. They moved toward it because that is what people do when their minds are split between curiosity and fear. They step closer. They tell themselves one more step will explain everything. The clearing was not large, elliptical, almost a perfect oval, as if the trees had agreed to lean back. In the middle, the leaves were parted, and the dirt had a sickly sheen. Half buried in the soil sat a circle of metal 5 feet across. Smooth, pitted in places, wet even though the ground around it was dry. It was flush to the earth like a lid over something deeper. The blue glow leaked through hairline seams, as if the thing were breathing under the surface. When the taller student placed his hand a few inches above it, the back of his teeth hummed. They ran. They tripped. One of them dropped his phone and doubled back for it, fingers shaking so hard he kept missing the lock screen. When they finally cleared the tree line, they could see the stadium lights dying to black behind them and a few stragglers still in the lot. The call came in breathless and broken. The dispatcher on duty logged it at 10:58 p.m. and wrote the words, "Possible downed equipment and unknown hazard." She sent a car anyway. Deputy Holden was first on scene at 11:14 p.m. His cruiser idled on the shoulder, hazard lights ticking, as he stepped into the timber with a mag light and an old habit of talking to himself when he felt a shiver he could not explain. He found the trail, he found the crushed leaves, he found the clearing in the metallic circle at its center. He crouched, he did not touch it. The beam of his mag light dimmed and ghosted out. So did his radio for a few seconds, an empty hiss like wind in a bottle. He clicked the mic anyway and said he needed backup, voice low and steady. He said there was some kind of device. He said the ground was vibrating. By 11:32 p.m., there were 3 patrol cars along Wilson Street and another a few hundred yards north where an old logging road cut into the trees. The officers moved slowly, shoulders tight, hands hovering near holsters because something about the air felt charged. They fanned out and circled the clearing. They each saw it. They saw the glow. They heard the hum under their boots, a note not quite sound, not quite pressure. One of them swore he could feel the hum in his throat. A sergeant named Avery decided they would do nothing until the state was notified. He did not want anyone touching the thing. He asked a younger officer to plant a traffic cone at the edge of the clearing, just to mark the entry point. The cone slid a few inches the second it touched the ground and settled crooked. That was when the sergeant said, very calmly, that everyone should step back. They did. At 12:10 a.m., the noise changed. The glow thinned to a paler shade, almost white, then flared. The trees around the oval bled shadows in every direction. Pine needles lifted and lowered as if stirred by wind, but there was no wind. Something in the dirt flexed. The men backed away again, boots cracking sticks, breath frosting in frantic bursts. A dozen birds erupted from the black trees and shot up, spiraling in confusion. Then everything went still. There were other calls that night. A woman in a house 2 blocks from the tree line complained that her ceiling fan began spinning backward at midnight opposite the switch. A man on Parkview Avenue said every photo on his living room wall was tilted in the same direction by morning, as if the house had been nudged. The 911 dispatcher added those to the log because she did not know what else to do. At 1:47 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs rolled into Millfield and slid onto Wilson Street, like they had practiced the turn. Their headlights were low, their plates were meaningless. The men who climbed out wore jackets without patches and carried cases they did not label. They walked into the timber without asking the officers anything beyond where. They set up tower lights. They dragged a blue tarp across the ground, then rolled it back like a tongue. They unloaded a portable generator that coughed, caught, and thumped. The sound masked the smaller hum beneath their boots, but it didn't erase it. People at the windows in the houses across the street watched in their kitchen dark and would later pretend they had fallen asleep. By sunrise, the clearing was a scar. The blue glow was gone. The metallic circle was gone. There was a pit 6 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and filled back up with a different color of soil, as if someone had brought in a fresher kind from a town away. The men with the cases walked out as the light came up and the SUV doors shut in a crisp rhythm like a marching band. The officers, pale and quiet, were told to finish the perimeter and take down the tape by noon. When a local reporter asked if there had been a gas leak or a sinkhole, the sergeant said the investigation was ongoing and the area was safe. He did not look at the reporter while he said it. What happened next is the part people argue about, because it is the part nobody can prove. In the week that followed, whenever the wind died, you could feel something in your chest if you stood at the edge of the clearing. Just a pulse. Not a noise, exactly. A pressure wave in the sternum. Some blamed power lines, others blamed factories 2 towns over. One man swore it vibrated his molars. A retired teacher brought a compass and watched the needle drag itself in a slow circle like it was drunk. A kid with a drone tried to fly straight over the trees, and the drone flipped, steadied, then drifted sideways, fighting something you could not see. The kid said, the camera feed developed a white halo at the exact moment it passed over the clearing. He deleted the clip a day later because the battery started swelling on his desk. A hiker vanished the following Thursday. He was a line cook at the diner on Old County Road, quiet, known for walking a lot after his shift to clear his head. His route took him along a dirt path that paralleled the tree line for a mile, then curved away. He never came home. The search started before sunrise. It ended after midnight. Dogs circled the oval of the clearing and whined. They pawed at the ground and would not cross onto the disturbed soil. The only thing the searchers found was the line cook's knit cap sitting upright on a low stump, as if someone had placed it there for him to come back and get. There were no prints that made sense. The sheriff stopped the search when the fog moved down from the ridge, and the beams of flashlights just made white walls. The next morning, a CCTV camera 2 blocks away showed something strange. At 3:12 a.m., every streetlight on Wilson Street flushed brighter for 1 second, then dropped to a dimmer glow. The tape showed that surge like a breath across the entire frame. That was when people stopped talking to officers at the coffee counter. They spoke to each other instead, over fences, across aisles at the hardware store, in the whispery dark of the church vestibule after evening service. They listed the oddities like tally marks, the fridge magnets that slid toward the left corner of the door, the auto shop's analog clock that ran slow, then fast, then slow, always around the same time of night, student tablets that charged on the bus, but immediately drained when brought to the corner of the field nearest the timber. A man who tried to mow his lawn near the trailhead said the mower's engine stuttered every time the blade pointed toward the pines. He turned in a slow circle and listened to the stutter keep time, click, 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 like a metronome. Nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud, but they all said it quietly, sooner or later. Whatever the men in the SUVs took that night, they didn't take all of it. Something was still there, something under the ground. 2 weeks after the first incident, a local radio host invited callers to share their stories, and the phone board lit up. A nurse described a patient who came in with steady vitals. Then the monitor leaped as if a hand had pushed on the chest pad. A teacher said her classroom projector flickered whenever she cued videos after lunch, but not during morning announcements. A mail carrier described standing, frozen, at the exact edge where the trail met the road, feeling like the woods were pressing against the front of his shirt. He put one foot forward, and the feeling grew. He put his foot back, and it eased. He did that 4 times, like he was stepping into cold water and back out, and then he turned around and delivered the rest of his route on the opposite side of the street. The police chief held a short press conference that Friday. At 4:00 p.m., 30 minutes before sundown, he read from a printed statement. He said state agencies had surveyed the area and found no environmental hazards. He said rumors were making people frightened, and frightened people misinterpret ordinary things. Someone asked whether there was any truth to the claim that the department had signed non-disclosure agreements. He folded the paper in half and said, "The town is safe." He said it twice. He did not take another question. On Sunday night, a group of neighbors decided to walk to the clearing as a kind of dare. There were 5 of them, all adults, all stone sober. They wore headlamps, thick jackets, and boots. They took a plastic bag in case they found any litter to prove their point when challenged online the next day. They reached the oval at 9:26 p.m. and switched their lamps to the lowest setting. The ground looked ordinary at first. Then their eyes adjusted. In the dirt were arcs, not drawn with a stick, but pressed by something heavy and curved. The arcs intersected and made almond shapes that overlapped like a chain of eyes. When one neighbor leaned to touch a shape, his headlamp fluttered and steadied. He said it felt like the dirt pulsed under his palm, a tiny upward push, then nothing. He swallowed hard and said he was done. They all were. At home that night, one of them found a thin layer of grit on the soles of his boots that glowed faintly when the bedroom was dark and the door was shut. Not bright, just enough to make him pull his foot back as if he had stepped on something, breathing. He scrubbed the boots with dish soap until his hands cramped. The calls to the department did not stop, but the responses changed. Officers said they were reassigned. Others said they were told to pass anything about Blackwood Pines to a different number. The 911 dispatcher who took the first student call transferred to a desk job 2 towns over. She told a cousin she did not like the way the phone sounded after midnight. She said there was a buzz you could hear if you pressed the receiver just right to your ear, as if a deep note lived inside the line and waited for you to listen. A winter storm hit, and the ground froze. For a while, the stories thinned. People said the snow sealed the place up. People said whatever had been under there was sleeping. But when the thaw came, so did the smell. Not rot, not gas. A faint, metallic scent like wet batteries mixed with pine and river rock. It made the skin at the back of the neck tighten. A trail runner gagged the first time he caught it and cut his loop short. A mother walking a stroller stopped, turned around, and went home by a longer route, heartbeat in her throat. One late evening, just before full dark, a state geologist parked along Wilson Street and walked in alone with a handheld meter and a notepad. She was not escorted, she was not announced. She paused at the edge of the oval, adjusted the meter, and stayed very still. A man smoking on his porch watched the pale rectangle of her notepad move as she wrote. When she came out, he asked how it looked. She met his eyes for a second and said the soil was non-compliant with expectation. Then she climbed into her car and drove away without her headlights for the first 30 feet. Months passed. People tried to make the whole thing into a story that could be told in a single sitting. They could not. It sprawled. It ducked when you reached for it. It tangled itself up in small evidence, 1,000 strange details that refused to turn into a single clean answer. A barista used a new grinder after the old one began arcing a flick of blue inside the housing. A school bus driver avoided a stop for a week because the children all got nosebleeds when the bus idled facing the timber. A runner mapped her jog and saw the GPS track deviate 3 feet to the left, then 3 feet to the right, then swing back, an invisible river pushing and pulling her as she kept her pace. She had not felt it. Or maybe she had and called it wind. The diner on Old County Road put out a tip jar with a hand-lettered sign that read for answers. It filled faster than the one for coffee. People laughed at that, then did not laugh. You could sit in the corner booth with the nicked Formica and hear someone at the counter tell the same story they swore they would never repeat. Their voice would drop, and you could see their hands flatten on the surface, palms down, as if they were steadying themselves against something that might tilt the room. When the anniversary rolled around, the town did not mark it, there were no posts from the department, no statements from the chief, no official anything. But the sky over Millfield was clear that night, and the moon sat low like a coin, and just after 11:00 p.m. 3 porch cameras along Wilson Street captured a thin sheet of fog sliding across the road from the woods to the houses without touching the ground. It flowed over the asphalt like oil. It climbed the curb without breaking. It reached the lawns and rolled back, retreating to the trees in one smooth motion. The cameras recorded that and then glitched for exactly 4 seconds each. In those 4 seconds, the timestamp stalled, then snapped ahead. People will tell you that what we found in those woods was a machine. Others will say it was a lid, and the real thing was beneath, and the men with the SUVs just took the lid. A few will tell you not to think of it as a thing at all. They will tell you to think of it as a place that does not belong where it is, a pocket of rules that don't match our rules, pressing up from underneath like a bubble caught under wallpaper. And if you stand in the right spot after midnight, they'll say you can feel the pattern it makes, the pulse that is not a sound, the pressure that is not a hand, the sense that something vast and patient has turned its attention toward you, not with eyes, but with the cold curiosity of a tide measuring a shoreline. Ask the police about it and watch what happens. Watch the way their faces go still, like a windless pond. Watch how their words slow down. They will say it was a utility issue. They will say the area is safe. They will say the rumors are making people nervous, and that nervous people see things. They will not describe the way the ground lifted under their boots that first night, a fraction of an inch, enough to make every muscle lock. They will not tell you how their radios went dead in their hands and how the silence in their ears was loud enough to make them flinch. They will not admit that for one long breath it felt as if the clearing was breathing back, and that something beneath the soil pressed up, testing the weight of the world, and then withdrew. They do not say that part. They look past you and talk about weather and new tires for the cruisers and the fundraiser for the K-9 unit. They change the subject. They ask how your family is. They call you by your first name and remind you to lock your car because there have been break-ins on the west side. But Millfield remembers. Houses remember. The trees remember. The oval is still there, pale dirt in a shape the rain can't undo. And if you stand on Wilson Street on a still night and stare into the dark line where the pines begin, you will notice how your breath feels heavier when you exhale, like the air is listening to you. You will notice that your phone degrades to a single bar for no reason at all. You will notice that the hairs on your forearms lift, even under your jacket, even with your fists shoved deep into your pockets. And you will think about the boys who saw the light, the officer who knelt and felt the hum in his teeth, the men who came and took what they could and left what they could not carry. You will think about the cap on the stump and the boots that glowed faintly in a darkened room. You will think about fog that crawled like an animal and lights that surged like a heartbeat, and the small, private way a person's face changes when they admit, just to themselves, that they have met something that will never fit into words. A discovery so strange, even police refuse to explain it. And maybe that is the only honest thing anyone has said about Blackwood Pines. Not that it is dangerous, not that it is safe, only that it is there, under the dirt and the leaves and the thin shell of what we prefer to believe is solid ground. It is there, and it is patient, and it is listening. If you go, do not step into the oval. Do not talk loudly. Do not drop anything you are not willing to leave behind. Go home while the streetlights still feel like a promise, and shut your door and set your phone face down on the table if it starts to buzz. If the house hums back at you in a slow, steady rhythm, do not answer. Stand very still. Wait for it to pass. And when it does, when the air lightens and your breath comes easy again, tell yourself the same thing everyone here tells themselves in kitchens and living rooms and quiet cars at red lights. Tell yourself it is over. Tell yourself it will not come back. Tell yourself that whatever moved under that clearing went back to sleep. Then listen very carefully to the silence that follows. If you hear the smallest tremor under your feet, a whisper you feel more than hear, do not look toward the trees. Look at your hands. Watch how they shake. Count your fingers. Say your name out loud to keep the room steady. A mystery buried beneath the floorboards. The house on Redfield Pike sat alone at the edge of a small Ohio town, its porch sagging over a square of cracked concrete and last summer's weeds. The mailbox leaned to one side, the number plate rusting at the corners. The roofline was a long, tired shrug against the sky. When the afternoon sun slid behind the millstacks and the wind came down from the hills, the whole place seemed to hold its breath, like a swimmer under cold water, waiting it out. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? On a Thursday in late October, a pair of headlights rolled up the gravel. Grant Nolan stepped out first, jacket zipped to his chin. His partner, Lena Hart, followed with a box of kitchen plates and a grin that looked brave. The air smelled like leaves and wood smoke from a neighbor's stove. Somewhere to the south, a dog barked and kept barking. It was just after 5, the clouds low, twilight coming fast. They unlocked the door and felt the way old hinges carry a memory of every hand that has ever turned them. Inside, the boards complained under their steps. The entryway opened to a narrow hall, a tight living room, a dining room with a single window facing a cornfield gone gold and gray. The kitchen had a wide sink, a rust ring, a back door that led to a small porch, and an oily driveway. Under the sink, a drip ticked in the quiet like a metronome. The place had sat empty for months. It smelled like dry paper and cold iron. They worked until 9. Boxes stacked by the front window, a blanket over the sofa, 2 mugs on the sill cooling in the draft. At 10:30, with the town gone to sleep, a sound rose from beneath the living room floor. Not the subtle groan of wood and nails, not the whisper of pipes. A dragging sound. Slow, deliberate. Something heavy shifting across packed earth. Lena looked at Grant, eyes wide. The sound stopped. They listened until the heater switched on and the vents began to sigh. By midnight, they laughed, said the place was settling, and crawled into bed. At 2:17 a.m., a single knock touched the underside of the bedroom floor. Then, nothing. Then 2 knocks, spaced like a code. Grant held his breath. The street outside was empty. The red digital clock watched them from the dresser. A car passed on the pike and faded. When another knock came, softer, Lena sat up. The heater cut off. All the house went still. They waited. The air grew heavy, as if rain was pressing its face to the windows. When the knock did not come again, they slept in fits until dawn and woke with headaches. Friday carried them into town, groceries at the corner market, a decent breakfast at a diner with a neon sign that buzzed even in daylight. The server, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Ivy, asked where they were moving in. When Lena told her Redfield Pike by the old mill road, the server blinked, paused, and said she remembered that place. Her aunt once called it the house that kept secrets. Ivy said it with a soft smile. She cleared their plates and did not come back as quickly. They returned after noon. Outside the living room window, a tractor pulled through the far field. Inside, cold air coiled in a strip across the floor like a river. The boards by the front window felt loose underfoot. One plank near the center gave a little when pressure shifted onto it. That night, the dragging sound came again, moving slow under the living room, then pausing as if to listen. At 2:11 a.m., 5 knocks. this time in a rhythm that was almost a message. Grant pressed his palm to the floor. The boards were cool. Beneath his hand, he felt a faint tremor, as though something living drew breath in the dirt. Saturday morning brought a step that no one could mistake for settling wood. A single pace under the hallway, toward the bedroom, then quiet. In the afternoon, Grant called a local contractor named Gus Rourke. Gus had a voice like a gravel road. He could come by on Monday and take a look beneath. In the meantime, Grant went to the hardware store and bought a pry bar, a headlamp, and a box of screws. Gus would roll his eyes, but Grant could not sit with the sound another night. He started in the living room. He marked the loose board with painter's tape. He loosened the nails until the plank lifted by an inch. The space beneath was dark and close. The day's pale light slipped through in a thin sheet. Lena held a flashlight. Dust lifted and spun in the beam like snow in slow motion. They saw stone piers, dry earth, a forgotten spoon, a mauled tennis ball, the sag of old insulation. The flashlight found a chain length draped across a beam, a piece of iron like a crude hook. A child's glass marble stuck in a hard ridge of dirt, frozen there by time. They widened the opening. They set the boards aside in a careful stack. Lena lowered the light again, and the beam showed a strange smoothness to the soil, as if that portion of the crawl space had been scraped flat by a careful hand. Close to the beam sat a small rectangle of something darker than earth. Grant lay on his stomach and reached down. His fingers found a wooden box with a rusted latch. The wood was dry as bone. He pulled it up, both of them breathing shallow, as if the air around it did not want to be disturbed. They opened it on the coffee table. Inside lay a stack of photographs tied with string, faces in stiff poses, a boy without a smile, a woman with a soft mouth and tired eyes. The edges of the photos were singed. The backs had pencil notes and blocky letters that listed first names and a word that read border. Under the photos was a folded page, brittle and yellow. The writing curved and leaned, a hand trying to stay neat that failed at the end. It said a name. It said Redfield Pike. It said the floor keeps talking. It asked the reader to forgive. It asked the reader to listen at 2 in the morning and to count. They counted that night. 2:10, 2:12, 2:14. At 2:16, the knocks began. 4 pauses, then 3. A space. 2. A space. 1. It felt like the pattern of someone who had been alone too long and had decided the only way to be known was to repeat the same request until the wood itself learned the sound. Lena wept without sound. Grant whispered that they would call the sheriff in the morning and that he would not mock them. He said this and realized he did not believe it. Sunday at 9, they called the county sheriff. A deputy named Cole arrived with a flashlight and a polite look that carried the weight of many long nights. He listened to their story, then crouched by the opening in the living room floor. He said animals make strange sounds in old crawl spaces. He said raccoons can sound like a person trying to remember how to be human. He said he would leave a number for a wildlife guy who could trap and relocate. Then he nodded at the box on the table. He asked if they had found it here. He asked if he could take a photo for the file. He did not ask to take the box, but he wrote down the names on the back of the pictures. He told them to keep the floors closed at night for safety. He drove away with his lights off. Sunday night carried the cold in early. The wind slid along the siding and found new paths into the house. At 1:50, a light knock came, almost polite. At 2, a short run of knocks like a breath taken too fast. At 2:14, a scratch on the joist that ran under the far side of the room. The scratch traveled toward them. Lena stared at the gap in the floor where the boards had been pried up and placed back. Through the seams, she saw a thread of darkness that did not look like any darkness she had seen. When she reached for Grant, his hand was shaking. On Monday, Gus arrived in a faded jacket. He was 2 steps into the living room when he set his tool bag down, knelt, and peered through the seams. He told Grant to move the couch and coffee table into the dining room. He measured the span between beams and tacked up a bright work light. He pulled 3 boards clean. The light pushed back a tide of gray dust and old air. The crawl space was shallow, maybe 2 feet high. Farther in, beyond the beam, there was a place where the earth dipped down with a shape not made by settling. Gus lay flat and angled the light. The dip was an oval. The soil there had been disturbed in a way that ignored time. Nobody breathed. Gus slid the flashlight in and tapped the dirt with a screwdriver. The tip sank. He brushed at the surface. The line of a seam appeared. He brushed some more. Wood showed. An edge, then a corner. He cleared a small lid of planks banded with wire that had rusted to dust. He said he would not touch another thing until the county came. He stood and dusted his hands, and in that motion, they saw he had been around death before and recognized when a room had been asked to host it. Sheriff Buckley came with Deputy Cole and a woman from the coroner's office named Dr. Alvarez. A woman from the county records office arrived too, Ivy Delaney from the diner with a badge clipped to her sweater. Everyone stood with the work light buzzing and the smell of old wood warming in the heat. Dr. Alvarez knelt by the opening. She looked at the oval in the floor and her face went still. She asked for a moment. She asked if anyone here had touched anything other than the loose boards. Gus said no. Grant and Lena said they had found the small box only. The sheriff asked to see the photographs. He asked if anyone had come by in the last few days. He walked the hall with slow steps and stood by the bedroom door for a long time. By late afternoon, they lifted the lid. The wire broke like sugar. The planks rose with a sigh. Cold air reached up like a hand. Under the lid lay a layer of waxed cloth. The cloth had been tied with twine. The knots were hard as stone. When they were cut, the cloth relaxed and the contents pressed upward in a small release, the way a held breath will release when a boat settles on water. Dr. Alvarez parted the cloth. Inside lay bones arranged with care, a skeleton placed on the right side, knees drawn as if sleeping. The skull was turned away. The left hand held a small object that first looked like a coin. It was a ring without a stone. Near the ankles lay a vial sealed with something black that might have been pine pitch. The pitch had cracked. A long strand of hair had floated in the oil trapped there and now curled in the cold air like a question. Even without the year, the whole scene spoke of a time when people used their hands to make things last and used the dark to keep things quiet. No one spoke for a long time. Then the sheriff began to talk the way a man will speak in a church, because he does not know if words can move like water, and so he tries to set them down like stones. He said the room was a scene. He said no one was to stay the night. He said the remains would be taken with care to the county building. Dr. Alvarez nodded. Deputy Cole stood by the front door and wrote a neat report. The wind shifted and blew a smell into the room that did not belong to the house. Wet stone, old ash, cold cellar earth. They slept that night in a motel by the interstate. The heater hummed. The room smelled like ginger cleaner and old fabric. At 2:13 a.m., Lena woke with the knowledge that the house was awake and that something on a low frequency had finally found new space to move. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the black eye of the television. Grant sat up and did not pretend to be sleeping. They did not speak. They held each other and watched the red numbers step forward into the new day. Morning gave them coffee and a call from Sheriff Buckley. The remains would be analyzed. The ring and the vial had been cataloged. The small wooden box had been taken into evidence after a phone call with the county attorney. Ivy from Records wanted to meet them at the courthouse. She said there was something they might want to see. She spoke in the careful tone of a person who understands that paper can weigh as much as iron. In a room that smelled like old ink and dust, Ivy set a ledger on the table. She turned pages with a flat palm. She stopped at a map that showed Redfield Pike and the original parcel that held their house. The name written there was Rowan. Beside it, another name, Talbot, marked the next parcel and a small notation that read boarding house in spiky script. Ivy told them the Rowan family built the house when the mill road went in. She told them the Talbot place had burned down long ago. She told them a man named Ephraim Talbot kept his back door open to drifters and workers during certain months. Ivy found another entry and tapped it with a short nail. The note said that a boarder named Vince Lowe was last seen on Redfield Pike, that he had worked a few days at the mill, that he had been paid in cash, and that he had taken to playing a harmonica on the porch when the sun went down. Grant asked the question that wrapped itself around the soft parts of the heart. If Vince had vanished here, and if a grave had been found under the floor, then who had done the burying? Ivy said the county had never solved that case. She said the mill was loud and that people forgot faces when the day was long. She said she wished she had better words. She slid another document across the table. It was a letter from a relative of the Rowans, written in angry strokes that dug into the page. It said the floor kept talking. It said a boarder would not be quiet. It said a prayer would not close. It said a ring kept turning up in the crack by the front window. It said mercy is not the same as silence. Late that afternoon, after a lunch they did not taste, after a walk past the old feed store and the post office with its flag roped tight in a cold wind, they drove back to the house with permission to collect clothes and a few things. The front door stuck for a second, then gave. The work light had been turned off. The living room felt hollow without it. The opening in the floor was covered in sheets of thick plastic taped down at the edges. A small marker flag had been set in the corner by a support pier. The silence had a pressure to it, like the inside of a shell. They gathered what they needed: coat, boots, a photograph that could travel. In the bedroom, Lena paused by the closet mirror and looked at herself in the dim light. Her face seemed older. When she stepped back into the hall, she felt a cool stream of air touch her ankle. The plastic in the living room shifted, not with a draft, with weight. Grant stared at the taped edges. A sound came from beneath the plastic, a small roll like a marble moving over wood. A pause, another roll. Something round found the lowest point and settled. They did not move. The round thing rolled again toward the taped seam by the wall and stopped. Grant peeled up a corner of plastic. He shone his phone light into the gap. The floorboards were closed there, sealed with new screws. Between two boards, in the narrow wedge of shadow where wood met wood, something silver gleamed. He slid a table knife into the seam and worked it gently. A thin silver chain lifted free. At the end of the chain hung a locket, oval and smooth, the hinge just visible, the metal worn by a thumb that had rubbed it 1,000 times. He laid it on the plastic. The chain trembled. The room felt crowded, though they were alone. He did not open the locket in that living room. He and Lena stepped onto the porch where the cold air moved and where the day still belonged to trees and trucks and distant dogs. He eased the hinge and opened it. Inside was a small photo of a young woman with eyes that held an expression neither sad nor content. On the opposite side, tucked behind the thin glass, a fold of paper with a line in cramped writing. It said, "I am under the boards." It did not say a name. It did not ask for help. It simply told the truth. They drove to the sheriff's office and handed over the locket. Sheriff Buckley studied it and did not hide the way his jaw set. He wanted to take a statement and did. He asked if they had found anything else, and they told him no. He said he would bring the locket to Dr. Alvarez. He would look up anyone in the Rowan or Talbot line still in the county. He suggested again that they not sleep in the house. He pressed his hands flat on the desk and stared at them as if to make the suggestion into a command without calling it one. For 3 nights, they stayed at the motel. They tried a rental cabin by the lake for a night after that. The quiet there felt honest and wide, the kind of quiet that comes with water and trees. Then at 2:17 a.m., a soft knocking touched the cabin floor, a sound like someone politely reminding them that their lives were not yet allowed to return to ordinary time. They left the cabin before dawn, coffee in paper cups, the lake a black sheet beside them. They did not go back to the motel. They drove the long way to Redfield Pike and sat in the car across from their house with the heater on low. In the square of the front window, something moved. Not a person. The faint shiver of the blind string pulling toward the floor and lying still again. The county worked fast. The ring had no inscription. The vial held oil with traces of resin. The strand of hair was human. Age could not be answered in a number without a year to point to, but Dr. Consistence. Alvarez said, the bones belonged to a woman. She said there were faint marks on the ribs that could have been left by someone who believed in folk protection. She said there was no obvious trauma that a body would keep forever. She said that sometimes the way a person is placed tells the story more clearly than any mark. She said this and looked tired, as if the bones had placed their own weight on her shoulders and asked to be carried. While the lab worked, Ivy called again. She had found a newspaper clipping that mentioned a girl from the Talbot place who went missing around harvest when the mill ran all night. The article did not say where she worked. It said she had come north on a train. It said she played a hymn on a harmonica when she could not sleep. Lena's face changed at that. In the still moments between knocks, a thin note had drifted through the floor on the second night. They had believed the sound was in their heads. The clipping made the sound real. The idea of a hymn moving through wood and dirt made the room colder even in memory. They made one more trip into the house with the sheriff's permission. Grant wanted a box of books he had stored in the bedroom closet. Lena wanted a sweater that hung on the hook by the back door. The front yard was a map of their footsteps through frost. The heater in the house had been set to low by a deputy to keep pipes from freezing. They walked through with purpose, did not linger, did not look at the plastic. In the hall, Lena stopped again, listening. A single knock came, thin as a coin flicked on glass. She whispered to the floor. She said they had seen the locket. She said a name would help. She said they would try. The floor did not respond, which felt like an answer. That night, they returned to the motel. They did not sleep until dawn. In the morning, the sheriff called with a small piece of news that felt larger than it was. A distant cousin of the Rowan line had recalled a story from an aunt. The aunt had said there was a time when a girl stayed at the house for a few days. She had been given a bed in the room by the front window. She had made tea in the kitchen and had washed her cup and set it to dry. Then, sometime before midnight, she had stepped outside and had not been seen again. The aunt believed the girl had run from someone who would not let her rest. The aunt believed the house had seen too much and decided to hold one thing back and keep it safe. The story had been told in pieces. The cousin's voice on the phone shook as he read his notes aloud. On the 6th night away from the house, they dreamed the same dream. A floorboard lifted like a lid, a pale wrist reached through, not a frightening hand. A hand that had waited long enough and now expected to be met halfway. In the dream, they placed their palms under the wrist and lifted gently, and the wrist withdrew, like a shy creature retreating to a burrow. They woke at the same minute. They stared at the ceiling. They cried a little without drama. They listened to the heater and made a decision. They met the sheriff mid-morning. They wanted to hold a small moment in the living room. They wanted a minister of any kind, not for a sermon, for a human voice speaking to a human story with a spine that refused to bend to silence. The sheriff called Reverend Pike from a church near the square. Reverend Pike had a bright scarf and patient eyes. He held a small book and he stood by the plastic in the living room, and he spoke in a clear tone that carried to the corners. He said a name, even though he did not know it. He called the person under the boards by the name she would have given herself when she left home. He said that name was known now. He said a door could open for souls as well as for bodies. He asked permission to set the locket on the plastic while he spoke. No one said no. When he finished, the heater cut off. The room grew so quiet they could hear the blood in their ears. Then the plastic settled a fraction as if a weight had shifted. A soft knock came from under the far beam under the front window. 2 knocks followed, spaced like a heartbeat. Then the house exhaled. A loose blind string tapped the glass once. The room kept its quiet. The quiet this time felt less like weight and more like a field after rain. Dr. Alvarez called a day later with one more detail. A lab in Columbus had extracted a partial profile from the hair and had compared it with a small set of people who had submitted to a county project for unidentified remains. The partial read did not match anyone yet. She believed a match might come. She said hope was not a strategy, but it was a way of walking from the bed to the door when the morning was cold. She said she would call if the computer found a hand to hold on the other side of that line. They hired Gus to install new supports, to level the living room, to replace the old boards with a layer of fresh pine over the original plank. He sealed the cut opening and left a small square section that was removable only with a special driver bit. He told them, houses remember. He told them the living rarely know how many hours of the day they spend walking above the stories of the dead. He wiped his hands and left a roll of underlayment by the wall with a nod that felt like respect. Grant and Lena moved back in near the end of November. The first night was a study in breath and quiet. The heater clicked and hummed. The trees de-leafed themselves against the windows. At 2:13 a.m., a soft knock came, far away, like rain beginning. Another followed, closer to the front window. Then nothing. A long nothing that felt like a hallway in a school after the bell. They slept. In the morning, they made coffee and opened the front door and let the cold rush in and then slam back out again. Their house was only a house. The floor under their feet felt steady and less like a lung. Some evenings, around 10, Grant would take his mug to the front window and look at the cornfield gone to stubble. A coyote would cross the far end of the field as if it had been written to do so, and the script could not be changed. The wind would lift the blind string and lay it back down. Then, from somewhere in the walls or under the joists, the faintest run of notes would drift and fade. Not a tune he could name. A hymn without a lyric. A line without words that sounded like a person easing into rest after standing all day by a door that no one else could see. They still kept the motel number folded in a book by the bed. They kept a box of clothes in the trunk through the first snow. They told themselves that caution is a form of respect. When they drove past the diner on Main, Ivy would wave them in. She asked every few weeks if anything had changed. They said only that the house felt different now, and that the nights were sometimes long but never empty in the way that makes you think about the road at 2 a.m., and the way it glows like wet tin. In January, Sheriff Buckley called with a voice that was careful. He said a woman downstate had been building her family tree for years and had shared a small amount of information with a nonprofit that helps identify unknown persons. A connection had been made to a line that touched this county for a season and then moved on. The name he gave them was simple and strong. When he said it, the sound had a weight that made even the air in the kitchen lean in. He did not say the year, he did not say the city, he said only that a name matters and that this was the right one. He asked if he could come by with Ivy to leave a copy of the paper for their records. He said the county wished to thank them for opening the floor and for standing in hard places without shouting. That night, just before 2, a soft sequence of knocks touched the joist under the front window. 4 pauses, then 3. A space. 2. A space. 1. The pattern from that first Friday came back and then faded, like a signature finished by a steady hand. Lena whispered the name the sheriff had given them. She thanked the house for not keeping what did not belong to it. She said rest and meant it. Spring will come. The corn will return to green. The house will warm and the front door will swell and stick. There will be shoes left on the mat and coffee rings on the table and 2 mugs cooling on the windowsill when the late light comes in thin and bright. If you stand on Redfield Pike and look at the front window, you might see the blind string lift and lie down again. You might hear nothing and call that peace. Or you might hear a faint note, music without a mouth, and you might consider that a name learned in the dark is still a name, and that under every floor there is a map of the lives that taught the wood how to speak. The mystery that was buried beneath the floorboards remains a mystery in the way the earth holds its own counsel. A ring without a stone, a locket with a face that could be anyone who ever waited for a door to open. A vial that kept a ribbon of hair safe in oil, a ledger recording a boarder who liked to play a hymn when the mill ran too loud, a sheriff who walked a hall in a careful way, an archivist who knew dust could carry a story across a century without shedding a word, a contractor who understood that respect can look like new screws driven into old plank, 2 people who signed a deed without knowing that the house they bought had a heart that beat. They bought it anyway. They listened. They learned the rhythm under the room where they drank coffee and count the minutes between one day and the next. And when the knocks came again and then fell silent, they knew what it meant. A hand at last released its hold on the underside of the world. A name stood up and left the floor behind. The boards settled. The house exhaled. And the night finally felt like night. A normal drive home became a real-life nightmare. Just after 9 on a cool autumn night, the parking lot behind the hardware store in Maple Bridge lay quiet and silver under the streetlights. The town was a small place in Rook County, tucked between cornfields and dark woods, the kind of place where people waved from porches and the corner diner knew how you took your coffee. The late shift had run long. The last customer wanted a new lock and a long conversation, and by the time the receipt printed, the clerk felt the weight of the hour resting on his shoulders. His name was Miles. He was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered from hauling lumber and salt bags, calm and steady in a way that made people ask him for directions and jumper cables. He locked the back door, breathed in the clean bite of cold air, and told himself the drive home would be a straight line through the quiet. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? He slid into his sedan, a dark blue car with a worn seat and a little squeak in the steering, and checked the time on the dash, 9:12. He sent a quick text to Nora, who ran the morning shift at the bookstore near the river, then tucked the phone into the cup holder. He liked the same route every night. Cross the bridge, take County Road 17 past the water tower, follow the long curve through Pine Hollow, and then a straight shot along Old Quarry Road to his neighborhood. 2 lanes, no traffic lights, a few mailboxes so faded you could not read the numbers even in daylight. A simple drive. The radio came on with a low murmur. He set it to a soft station, something with warm voices and a piano that sounded like it was recorded in a church basement. The car hummed. The river glinted through the trees like a ribbon of graphite. A thin mist hovered just above the asphalt. Every few hundred yards, a farmhouse light glowed in the distance and then slid away behind him. Peace laid over the road like a blanket. At the start of Pine Hollow, the trees crowded in, tall and dense, their black shapes knitting together overhead. The white lines flashed beneath the hood. Miles knew each curve here by muscle memory. He knew where the pavement buckled, where the shoulder dipped, where deer liked to step out of the corn and test their luck. He drove a respectful speed. He had changed a tire at 2 in the morning once and would prefer to never repeat that event. He did not notice the dark car until the last second. It sat on the right shoulder with its hazard lights blinking, hood up, driver door open just a crack. The red flash of the hazards pulsed across the lane and painted the white guardrail a sickly shade. A purse lay on the passenger seat, scattered open like it had been turned over, lipstick rolling into a cup holder, a wallet half out, a key ring dangling. A phone was on the ground near the hinge of the open door. The interior light burned steady, a lonely little sun in an empty cabin. He lifted his foot, not quite braking, just thinking. He had stopped for people before, and he would stop again. But something about the scene pressed a thumb into his ribs. Why the phone on the ground? Why the door ajar? Why no one waving a flashlight or standing in the beams? The car itself looked wrong in a way that was hard to name. Windows dark, like there were blankets taped inside. Hood up, but no steam, no smell of oil, no scratch of tools. He coasted by and told himself he would call it in at the next rise where the cell bars were better. His chest felt tight. He passed and kept passing. The hazards pulsed behind him and then shrank and fell back into the tunnel of the trees. The mirror caught a flicker of movement. He glanced up and felt his throat seize. In the wash of his taillights, a shape unfolded from the abandoned car, too tall to be comfortable inside. It had been crouched behind the steering wheel, folded small, and now it stood in the open door and tilted as if measuring distance. Pale skin or maybe a white mask flashed once and vanished as the hazards blinked. The shape slid back down. The door closed. The hazard stopped. Miles gripped the wheel. He felt the old instinct to turn around and make it right, the same instinct that made him stop for a wandering dog or carry groceries for a stranger. The instinct wrestled with a colder voice that was saying, keep moving, call for help soon. Do not be the person who pulls over for a stage scene. The colder voice won. He pressed the accelerator. The low hills of the hollow rose and fell like a wave train. The radio turned into background static. He checked his phone. No signal. The little triangle sat empty. He lifted the device toward the windshield as if altitude might help. Nothing. He set it down and tried to breathe evenly. A white sign flashed by that warned of sharp turns. The trees pressed close again and the road narrowed. The night felt alive now, the kind of alive that made hairs stand up even under a hat. A pair of headlights appeared in the mirror, far back then closer. He told himself it was a traveler who had come up fast on the straight stretch. He told himself that people tailgate at night because they want your lights to pull them through curves. He told himself to ignore it. The headlights grew larger, bright enough to paint the outline of his back seat. The following car drifted left, then right, then dropped back like a swimmer testing a current. No passing now, not here. Miles kept his speed steady. He did not tap his brakes. He knew that tap could look like a challenge. The following car closed the distance in a quick surge. Its beam climbed the rear glass and stung his eyes. He could see the shape of a tall hood, a long windshield. He could see a dent on the front bumper on the right side. He could see a strip of black tape where a turn signal should have been. The same car. He knew it, bone deep, the way you know the shape of your own hands. His mouth went dry. The road ahead ran straight for a quarter mile before the next bend. At the end of that straight, he could see the faint comfort of a reflective mile marker and the ghostly outline of the old quarry fence. His car could handle 70 for a little while, but anything higher made the engine whine and the steering go light. He pressed the pedal and felt the floor. The following car matched him without effort. It drifted, right until its right front tire kissed the gravel on the shoulder, then snapped left again, a silent show of control that read like a threat. It fell back, then surged forward and bumped his bumper once, a shallow metal kiss that shoved his sedan forward with a hard jolt. The seatbelt cut across his chest. His teeth clicked. He corrected the wheel, breathed out through his nose, kept the lane. Another bump. Harder. A brief grind of metal. He felt a sting along his ribs as the belt bit. The road curved left here. On the right, a black drop into scrub and stone. He had helped tow someone from that ditch at noon in high summer. He had seen the gouge in the dirt that could swallow a wheel. He held the center while his heart pounded like a mallet. Up ahead, a green sign glowed, small, nothing fancy. Tucker Fuel, 3 miles, open all night. He pictured the little island of light by the highway, the gumball machine inside, the ringing bell over the door, the sign that always hung crooked over the coffee pot. He aimed himself at it like a ship aiming for a lighthouse. He kept his speed high enough to keep the space between, low enough that he could control the next curve. The pursuing car hung on his bumper, its brights flared. Miles felt the headache that comes from light burning hot inside the skull. The road leveled. The gas station sign rose up like a promise. A lone pump. A long shadow of a pickup near the side wall. A storefront with cheap blinds and shelves of antifreeze. He took the turn into the lot at a clean angle and stopped close to the door. So close that if anyone wanted his driver door, they would have to squeeze against the building. The other car slid past on the highway, slowed for 3 counts, and then poured on speed and disappeared. No plates were visible. The rear glass looked painted from the inside. The door to Tucker Fuel opened with a bell that sounded eager. The air smelled like coffee and grape soda. A woman behind the counter looked up, shock widening her eyes. Her name tag said, Marla. She wore a faded sweatshirt with a wolf on the front. Miles tried to keep his voice low, but everything came out in short reports. He told her there was a car. He told her the bumps. He told her he needed to call the sheriff. He felt like his words bounced around and did not land, like a dozen beads spinning in a cup. Marla rounded the counter without asking and walked the glass with him. She clicked the deadbolt and pulled the thin chain across the door. She pointed to the phone. He dialed. A calm voice answered at the county dispatch center and asked for location, nature of emergency, description. He gave the mile markers. He gave what he had seen. He tried to be slow and careful, but his breath kept catching. The dispatcher told him to stay inside and to keep the car where it was, nose toward the door. The dispatcher told him a deputy was already on the way from the river bridge and would arrive soon. The dispatcher told him he had done the right thing. Marla poured him coffee without asking. He wrapped his cold hands around the paper cup and stood where he could watch the road. She said he could stand in the office if he wanted. He said here was fine. A minute stretched long. The clock over the chips ticked. A truck rolled past on the highway and kept going, no trouble, just a ghost on a line. Then the red and blue lights bloomed against the glass like a sunrise. Deputy Ana Ruiz stepped out with her hat tilted low against the chill. She moved with the quick stillness of someone trained to be calm when other people are not. She examined the bumper first. The rear right corner had a scar of bare metal where paint was scraped clean, dust of blue curled like dry skin. She crouched and studied the gouge and then took pictures, each one marked by the white flash of her small camera. She asked Miles to repeat his story. He said it again, this time in a voice that sounded like the one he used at the store when he needed to explain a return policy. He heard his own words line up and tried not to think about the way his pulse was still climbing. Another unit arrived. Deputy Reed, a broad man with a radio voice that sounded like gravel. They took statements from Marla, too. She had not seen the other car, but she put her hand on the counter to show how Miles had put his hand on the counter and how cold his skin had been. Ruiz said she would sweep the highway up to the hollow. Reed would go back toward the bridge. If the car was out there, they would find it. They did not find it. Not the abandoned car, not the pursuit car, nothing. There were faint tire marks in the gravel at the place where the hazards had flashed, but the marks were confused by dozens of older tracks and the soft brush of wind. The phone that had been on the ground was gone. If it had ever been there at all, the road had swallowed it. Reed called in from the bridge with the same report. Nothing. The night had closed behind the event like a curtain. Ruiz returned to tuck her fuel and told Miles she would follow him home. She asked if he had someone waiting. He said yes, Nora, at the house near the ball field. He said he would call on the way as the bars returned. She told him to take it slow. She would stay right behind with her lights off until they reached the neighborhood. He thanked her. His gratitude came out rough and quiet. They drove, Ruiz a patient shadow in the mirror. The night felt thinner now, stretched but alive. Miles thought about the figure unfolding from the car. He thought about the way the hazards had clicked off before the pursuit began. He thought about timing and planning and how easy it would be on an empty road to play at hunting. He checked the ditches for any flicker of movement and saw only rows of cornstalks rattling like bones. At home, Nora stood on the porch in a wool jacket, hair tied up in a knot that meant she was tired and annoyed and worried at the same time. A porch light made her face look pale and strong. She took one look at the bumper and swore under her breath. Ruiz spoke to them both. The deputy was careful not to tell them stories. She said there had been reports in neighboring counties of staged breakdowns, cars waiting for good Samaritans, people who had been forced to the shoulder by nudges and then robbed, sometimes just robberies, sometimes worse. She told them to keep the car in the garage if they could, to call if any unfamiliar vehicle idled at the corner for more than a minute, to save the shirt Miles had worn in case residue could be lifted from the fiber. Ruiz did not raise her voice. She spent 20 minutes making sure they had the number to the direct line. Then she left, slowed down the block, pausing once to look back, as if to let the neighborhood know someone was watching. In the morning, Miles noticed a tiny black scuff under the trunk lip. It looked like gum, but felt like hard plastic. He pried it with a flathead screwdriver, and a small rectangular magnet came loose, stuck to a plastic shell no bigger than a matchbox. The device clattered onto the driveway. Inside was a battery and a little printed board with a chipped corner. He had seen trackers online at the store when he stocked the shelves. Not the same brand, but the same shape and use. He took a photo and texted it to Deputy Ruiz with a single sentence that read, "Found this under the trunk." He waited in the kitchen with his second cup of coffee and the quiet thump of the refrigerator. The deputy called back fast. She asked him to seal the device in a sandwich bag and leave it on the porch. She told him she would swing by on her lunch hour to pick it up. She told him he had done the right thing again. He did not feel right. He felt like someone had been inside his life without permission. Work felt like play acting that day. The aisles were the same. The bell over the door made its friendly sound. He cut key blanks and hauled birdseed bags to the tailgate of a pickup. He showed a retired teacher how the garden hoses were organized by length and price. He smiled. The smile drifted. In his mind, he kept seeing the shape unfold from the car and the way the hazards went dark. He kept seeing the long windshield of the chase car and the flat blank of its rear glass. He stepped outside at lunch and stood in the sun to warm up. He listened for tires. He heard only a train on a far line. That evening, he changed his route. He told himself this was not fear. It was caution. He took River Road to the highway and looped past the outlet mall with the bright new stores and the mulch smell from the landscape beds. He made his way to the Maple Lantern Diner and sat at the counter for a bowl of chili with chopped onions and a square of cornbread. The place was cheerful and chrome bright. A man 2 stools down noticed the fresh scrape on the bumper and asked the casual question people ask when they want to hear a good story. Miles gave a simple version and watched the man's face flatten. The man was a long-haul driver who knew every turn on County Road 17. He said he had seen a car with a taped turn signal parked at the pull-off near Black Creek Bridge 2 nights before. He had seen another driver slow and then dart away. He said he had reported it to the highway patrol. He said he had not stopped. He said, "Good on you for not stopping." The weekend came, the town breathed. High school football under the lights filled Friday night with the sound of brass bands and the soft thud of running feet. Saturday morning smelled like cinnamon rolls. Miles and Nora walked the farmer market and pretended the world was as simple as the bushel baskets in front of them. He scraped the garage floor clean and made a neat line of tools and sworn off words. He thought the week had been a lesson and it was over. Sunday night proved him wrong. At 9:24, he turned from the highway onto his street. A dark sedan idled at the corner by the ball field. Its lights were off. There was no driver visible. The windows were too dark. He slowed and looked without turning his head. The car did not move. He passed, parked, and sat with the engine idle, counting to 30. The sedan rolled away as soft as a thought. No plates again, no visible stickers or dents, just the shape of a car built to vanish in plain sight. He did not sleep well. He dreamed of long lanes of white lines that ran out into corn, of doors that closed on their own, of hands under the trunk lip. He woke at 1 to the thrum of a distant engine and lay still listening. It faded. He woke again at 2 to the scrape of tires on gravel. By morning, he felt thinner at the edges, as if his skin had been sanded. On Monday, Ruiz called with an update. The tracker had no stored data that the lab could pull. The chip was cheap and anonymous. It might only have broadcast a low signal to a nearby phone. The deputy said a similar device had turned up in another case near a rest area off the highway. Nothing concrete tied the events together. She told him again to be careful and to call if anything felt wrong. He listened hard to the calm in her tone. He borrowed some of that calm and held it like a tool. The week slid by in a way that felt off balance. Twice, he noticed a dark sedan in the distance on his way home. Once at the water tower, once idling near the feed store. He kept his speed controlled and stayed under bright signs in view of cameras and curious staff. He began to think about how many cameras watched the road that saved him, and he felt grateful for their dumb glass eyes and silent patience. He stopped at Tucker Fuel every night, bought a pack of gum he did not need, and stood for a minute making conversation with Marla, who had switched from wolf sweatshirt to a shirt with a faded mountain and a hawk. Routine grew like a shield. On Thursday, a curious piece of news swept through town. The sheriff's office released a short note that asked drivers to avoid stopping for stranded vehicles on unlit 2-lane roads. The note advised pulling into the nearest lit area and calling the situation in from a safe spot. It did not mention arrests. It did not mention a car with a taped light. People read it and nodded. People told other people that you could not be too careful. On Friday, Miles found an old dash camera in a clearance bin at work. He had not wanted to become the sort of person who documented everything, but the old part of him that liked neat rows and hardware that matched said this was a small price for a quiet night. He wired it up before he clocked out and set the little lens to watch the road from the center of the windshield. The camera was not fancy, but the tiny screen showed the white lines bright and honest. Just after 9, he crossed the bridge. He stayed off County Road 17 and took the longer sweep past the mall. He slowed at a yellow light and felt his phone buzz. He did not check it. He rolled past the Maple Lantern and thought about coffee. He chose home. He turned on to Old Quarry Road and let the car settle into that friendly groan it made at 52. The world softened. He exhaled. In the mirror, a dark shape appeared. It hugged the lane divider, then moved to the right, then drifted left. It held back at a steady distance. The distance did not feel like coincidence. He could hear the hollow beat of his own pulse in his ears. He picked his landmark. 2 miles ahead, a warehouse with floodlights sat at the corner of Flint Street. There were always night staff, moving pallets. There were always cameras, bright ones that made even clean cars look guilty. He would not be chased into the woods again. He would pick a bright place and make the line of travel predictable. The dark shape moved closer. It drew up alongside for a breath, then tucked back as if performing a little test. He kept his hands at 10 and 2, felt like a student again, paid attention to his rear bumper and the space that wrapped around him like a bubble. The shape settled in behind. Its lights stayed low. It did not bump this time. It simply shadowed him in a way that said, patience. The word made the skin between his shoulders tighten. The floodlights at the warehouse bloomed white and strong. The lot lay open like a stage. A forklift crossed slow in the far lane. A worker in a neon vest stood smoking near a stack of pallets that seemed to go on forever. Miles eased into the turn lane and hit his signal. The shadow car slowed with him. He thought about pulling mid-lane and stopping hard, letting the pursuer choose. But even in imagination, the tactic felt like a risk that did not pay. He chose a simple entrance and swung into the lot. The dark sedan rolled past instead of turning. It coasted to the far side of the intersection and paused. From where Miles sat, he could see no driver, only a black interior with a hint of a pale shape. His heartbeat stopped trying to leap and settled into a heavy drum. He killed his engine and stepped out into the blast of warehouse light. The worker in the neon vest flicked his cigarette and waved. Miles waved back and felt irrational gratitude for a stranger chewing mint gum. He stood by his car for a full minute and watched the dark sedan. A long truck rolled through, diesel whispering like a river. The sedan moved again, a slow roll, then a rise of speed. It drifted away down Flint Street and dissolved into dark. Miles opened his phone and called Ruiz. She answered with a tired voice that still sounded like a shield. She told him a unit was nearby. She asked him to remain where he was. She asked if he was alone. He said he was, but the way he said it made it sound as if he was not. A patrol car eased into the lot under the glare. Ruiz stepped out. She had a look on her face that said she wished she could be 2 places at once. She stood next to him, and together they watched the road without speaking for a long stretch. She finally said they had found a vehicle 2 towns over earlier in the evening, plates that returned to a car reported wrecked in another state, interior stripped bare like a bone, windows painted on the inside, no fingerprints worth lifting. She said a neighbor in a farm lane had reported a similar vehicle last week. She said they were not alone in this. The way she said it made it sound like both a comfort and a warning. 2 more weeks passed. The nights grew colder. Nora placed a small baseball bat by the door, even though she had always made fun of people who kept weapons by the door. Miles learned to notice the pattern of his own taillights reflected in the back of delivery vans. He learned the angle that made a plate readable on a dash camera. He learned to repeat details the way dispatch wanted them. His brain felt like a filing cabinet that had been put in order by someone neat and stern. One night, near the end of that second week, the story gathered its last sharp edge. Miles had stayed late to help at the store with the first rush of holiday boxes. He left at 9:40. The town had already put up the lights that make the river look like a line drawn in sugar. He ran the long route past the mall and then cut toward the quarry because the lines there comforted him. The road was empty. At the rise near the water tower, his headlights licked over a parked car near a pull-off. The hood was up, the hazard lights flashed, the driver door sat open a little, a bag lay on the passenger seat, a phone lay on the blacktop inches from the door. Every detail was the same. Every detail was a script. His heart climbed up and tried to hide in his throat. But some other part of him, a part assembled from 13 sleepless nights and the way a tracker feels under your fingers, took control. He did not brake. He did not even slow. He drifted slightly toward the center line to give the scene a wide berth. He watched the door in the corner of his eye. A shape unfolded and stayed low. The hazards clicked off exactly as before. The dark car slipped from the pull-off and rolled out behind him like a toy pulled by a string. Miles did not run. He held 55 like a promise. He let the distance exist. He aimed for Tucker Fuel with a calm certainty that felt like a blade. He pulled into the lot and set his bumper to the glass with the exact same angle as before. Marla looked up with a face that was already moving. She reached for the phone without being asked. She kept her eyes on the road while the call went through. The dark sedan passed the station, slowed, paused, and flowed away. The bell over the door chimed like a heartbeat. Above the counter, an old black and white television crackled with a game he could not see, only the uniforms, white blur against green blur. This time, Ruiz did not go to the shoulder. She did not search the ditch. She had another unit waiting a mile down in the dark, turn that twisted before the bridge. They did not run lights. They sat quiet. When the dark sedan came around the curve, a spotlight hit it from the bank side with a clean square of hard white. The car hesitated. Reed pulled out and pinned the angle. The sedan tried to jump the shoulder. The shoulder dipped and grabbed the front tire. The car skidded and spun once and went nose first into a low ditch that stayed dry even after heavy rain. The engine screamed and then coughed. The driver door flew open and two figures ran into the scrub. They were fast. The deputies chased, but the night swallowed the shapes the way it always swallows what it wants. Back at the car, Ruiz found the windows painted inside with flat black. The interior was stripped, the rear seats were gone, there was no backplate. The front plate was the wrong number by 1 digit, a trick for any casual glance. In the trunk well, where a spare tire should sit, there was only a clean circle and a smell like rubber and glue. Nothing in the car tied to a name, nothing in the field led to a house. The tow truck took the sedan away under a tarp. Ruiz drove by the station at 2 in the morning and told Marla that the car would not be back. She told Miles that the world does not always give you a name you can hold, but sometimes it gives you the absence of a threat, and that is worth something too. She told him this would probably stop now. She told him to keep the camera running anyway. It did stop. Life retook its shape. Not quite the same, but strong. Miles went back to County Road 17 in daylight only. At night, he took the bright route and let the floodlights bless his hood. He kept a small kit in the trunk, water and flares and a blanket because planning soothed him. He talked to strangers a little less, but when he did talk, he looked them in the eye and listened until they were done. Nora teased him about his cautious roots, but her voice had that soft center that meant she approved. Sometimes he would stop by the warehouse on his way home and sit for 5 minutes watching pallets move and lights blink on and off like patient stars. Sometimes he would pull into Tucker Fuel for a coffee he did not need, and Marla would tell him about a stray cat that had adopted the dumpster, and they would stand there in the hum of the cooler and the sugar smell of donuts and admire the way a small animal can survive on a patch of asphalt if it chooses. Sometimes, on a windless night, he would drive the long curve and catch sight of the pull-off where the first scene had been arranged, and he would feel the strange mixture of gratitude and anger that lives in the chest of any person who has seen something near and ugly and survived it. In Rook County, people began to tell new stories at their kitchen tables. They told each other to drive to the light. They told each other to trust their gut. They told each other that help is real, but so are traps, and that both truths can live in the same night. They said the deputies had done good work. They said the night feels different now, but different can mean safer if you do not let fear steer the wheel. One evening in late fall, a thin rain fell, and the river ran high. Miles left the store at 9:40 again and took the bright route by habit. The dash camera winked its red light. He crossed the bridge and felt the tires roll easy on wet lines. At the warehouse corner, a long truck stood still with its hazard lights ticking. A young driver waved with both hands. Miles felt his chest tighten, then felt at ease. He pulled near, not too near, and stayed inside the car while he called the number from the sticker on the truck door. The dispatcher answered and sent a service unit. The driver put his hands up to say thank you and stayed by his cab. No one unfolded from the dark. No one bumped a bumper. A service truck arrived, and the night resumed its plain shape. Miles took a breath that went all the way down. He drove home and sat for a moment with the engine off in the driveway, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the soft, tired rain. Later that night, he stood by the kitchen sink and watched the street through the little diamond window. The porch light made a pale coin on the step. A neighbor walked a dog that wore a tiny raincoat. Somewhere down the block, a television laughed. He thought about how close a person can come to something mean without seeing its name. He thought about a simple rule that had saved him: drive to the light, and he felt a quiet swell of thanks for Marla and for Ruiz and for every forklift operator and truck driver who has ever made a parking lot bright for a stranger at the edge of panic. He turned off the light and went to bed. The house settled, the wind touched the eaves, he lay still, and he listened. The world was not safe, the world was not fair, but the world contained light, and he had seen the way it pushed back the dark when it mattered, and that memory sat in him like a small fire that would not go out. He dreamed of straight roads and morning fog that burned off quick. He dreamed of a sky the color of brushed steel. He woke just before dawn and felt steady. On the drive to work that morning, the river was a wide mirror. The sun climbed slow. The blue sedan held the lane like a faithful horse. He passed the spot near the water tower and did not look too long. He passed Tucker Fuel and waved to Marla, who had propped the door with a brick for the fresh air. He pulled into the lot behind the hardware store and sat for one last quiet moment before unlocking the back door. He looked in the mirror at his own face, older by a notch, sharper in the eyes, and he nodded once, as if to mark the change and accept it. A normal drive had become a real-life nightmare. It had also become a reminder, the kind that hurts and teaches in the same breath. He had listened to the voice that said, "Keep moving toward the light." He had learned the shape of danger on an American two-lane road. He had learned that help is often just a door and a bell and a person who looks up and cares enough to move. He had learned that some nights you choose the route with cameras and forklifts and floodlights, and that choice is not fear, that choice is wisdom. He took the keys from his pocket, felt the small weight, and went inside to start the day. He should have never opened that door. It was late on a Friday night in a quiet town on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. The air felt heavy after a day of rain, and the road that curved past Ashwood Drive shone with a thin black gloss. Porch lights were dim, televisions glowed behind curtains, and a freight train in the distance called out with a low horn that rolled over the roofs like a warning. At the end of the street stood the old boarding house, a brick rectangle with a sagging porch and a doorbell that never worked. Inside that house, a man named Daniel tried to sleep, but sleep had been avoiding him for weeks, and the night had other plans. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Daniel rented a narrow room on the second floor, right above the front door. He worked at a warehouse near the river, sorting shipments that came in long after sunset. He was the quiet type, steady at a job that did not ask questions. He kept a small schedule on his wall, neat and orderly lines with times blocked out for work and meals and the odd call to his sister in Ohio. He did not drink, he did not go out, and he did not believe the stories the tenants traded in the stairwell. The ones about the basement, and the thing that moved in the old crawl space behind the laundry, and the door at the end of the second floor hall that never opened for anyone. At 11:43 p.m., while he was sorting a stack of bills under the glow of his small lamp, the radiator clicked and sighed, the rain ticked at the window, and from the hallway came 3 slow knocks. The sound was hollow and patient. It did not sound like someone calling on a neighbor. It sounded like a rhythm that had started long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. He waited. The knocks did not repeat, so he told himself it was the pipes, or the wood, or the wind that rattled the downspout. He stood anyway, as if a string had been tied around his ribs and tugged him toward the door. He opened his room and leaned into the hall. The overhead light's hum buzzed through a yellow haze. The carpet was thin and stained near the edges. At the far end, past the framed exit map and the dusty fire extinguisher, stood a door that matched none of the others. It was a touch taller, a touch narrower, as if it had been measured for another house and shoved into place here, a compromise in wood and paint. He knew the stories, that it was a storage closet, that it was a sealed stairwell, that it did not exist, and everyone else was bored or cruel or both. He also knew that when he first moved in, he counted the doors on both sides on his way to the far end, then counted the windows from the street, and the numbers did not agree. The landlady, Ms. Whitcomb, waved him off with a thin smile. "Old houses have tricks," she said. "Old carpenters make mistakes." He wanted to believe that, so he did, right up until 11:43 p.m. When someone, somewhere, knocked 3 times and asked to be heard. He walked toward it. The carpet gave a tired sigh under each step. When he got close, he smelled damp earth, like a garden shovel pulled from a hole. He touched the knob. It was cold, colder than any metal should be in a hallway with steam heat hissing from a register. He told himself not to turn it. He told himself to go back, lock his own door, and wait until morning. Then he heard a whisper that was hardly a sound at all. He stood very still. The air felt thinner. The lights flickered as if they were trying not to look. He told himself that words can be imagined, that one voice can be another voice in disguise. The whisper came again, almost kind, almost a hum, drawn out through teeth that did not belong to a face he could picture. He turned the knob. The latch slid back without resistance. The door opened an inch and stopped with a tired groan. A draft slid through the gap and brushed his face. It felt like the first breath from an old cellar or the mouth of a tunnel that had not seen daylight in a very long time. He raised his lamp. The light reached into the opening and touched nothing. No wall, no shelves, no stored paint cans or broom. The darkness did not behave like a shadow. It looked like a place where light did not live. He shut the door. He locked it. He pressed his palm to the frame and felt a tremor pass through the wood, like something unseen had placed its hand there as well. He walked back down the hall and did not run. He closed his room, turned his own lock, and leaned back against the door with his eyes closed. His heart stuttered against his ribs. He told himself he did the right thing. He told himself that he had not actually opened it at all. Then he noticed the smell of damp soil in his room, and he noticed that the wind had stopped, but the curtains still moved. At 12:07 a.m., the knocks returned. Not at the end of the hall, right behind his head. 3 slow raps on his own door. He shouted that it was late, that he would call the police, that whomever it was had the wrong room. The knock stopped. A soft scrape moved down the bottom edge of the door, like fingers feeling along for a seam. He stayed awake until 3:11 a.m., with the lamp on and the window cracked. He woke hours later with his cheek on the desk and light pushing around the shade, like a gentle threat. He almost convinced himself it was a dream until he saw the scrap of paper pinned under his mug. The paper looked ripped from a notebook. He had no notebook like it. 3 words had been written with a blunt pencil. "You let me." He lifted the note with 2 fingers and felt grit on the bottom, tiny grains that looked like sand from a riverbank. He set it down and felt the house breathe. He decided to go to work early. He turned and found the door to his room, not where he left it. He had left it on the wall that faced the hall. Now the wood stood 2 feet to the right, the door frame had moved with it, the paint edges were clean. The old screw holes that should have shown where the hinges lived were gone. For a long moment, he thought he had simply misjudged the distance. Then he stepped back and saw a pale rectangle of wallpaper that had been spared by some old dresser, and the rectangle no longer lined up with anything. He said his own name out loud, the way someone falling says a word to hear a human sound, and he left for work without breakfast. For a few days, he did not touch the far door. He did not walk to the end of the hall. He took the stairs in the back and left by the kitchen because the front porch swayed under a weight he could not see. He heard stories from the others. Nora, on the first floor, said something brushed her ankle while she folded laundry, and no one else was in the room. Jonah, in the smallest room under the attic, said his alarm clock rang at 2:13 a.m. Every night, even when he unplugged it, and one night when it rang, he felt something cold pass over his face, as if it was testing how he breathed. Ms. Whitcomb said the water bill had doubled and no one had taken longer showers. They said these things with the nervous humor of people who want to hear themselves deny what they fear. By the end of the week, the knocks came on the front door at odd hours. 3 deliberate raps and then silence. A delivery showed up with no return address, 1 box of nails, and a hammer that looked like it had been in a fire. The porch light went out and could not be coaxed back to life. When the postman came, he asked if they had started digging in the yard. He said he could smell wet clay when he dropped the mail, and someone had left a shovel leaning against the porch rail. No one owned a shovel like that. The blade had been ground so thin, it flashed like a mirror when the sun cleared the clouds. At 9:26 p.m. on a Monday, he came home to find the hallway colder than the outside air. He reached his room and saw that his lamp was on and his window had been raised, though he remembered very clearly lowering it before he left. He went in and froze. On his bed, placed on the folded blanket as carefully as a gift, lay an old brass key. The teeth were sharp, the bow worn smooth by long use. There was a tag tied to it with a bit of frayed cord. The tag had 2 words written by the same blunt pencil. For you? He held the key and felt a pressure in his ears, as if he had driven up a mountain without noticing. He knew, without any logic, that the key would fit the door at the end of the hall. He also knew that the door had not needed a key when he turned it a week ago. He set the key on the desk and told himself he would ignore it. At 10:01 p.m., his light dimmed, not like a line sagging on the grid, but like a hand placed over a mouth. The key slid across the desk with a soft metallic breath and fell into his palm. He went to the hall and walked to the far door before he could give himself a reason not to. He did not want a reason. He wanted the space between the knocks to end. He pressed the key into the lock. The metal welcomed it. He turned his wrist. The tumblers whispered. The door swung inward without sound. The dark inside pulled at the light in the hall. The bulb did not flicker this time. It simply failed, like an eye that refused to look. He held the door with a shaking hand. He raised his lamp and leaned forward. The air smelled like iron and moss. The floor beyond the threshold did not look level. It tilted down and away, not like a staircase, but like a slope, as if the door opened to a place that was beneath the house and also someplace else. He said hello, then winced at the sound of his own voice. The dark answered with a slow rasp. It sounded like breath pulled across brick. He shut the door and locked it with the key and hung the key on a nail above his bed, determined to prove that he was still the one who decided where things belonged. He did not sleep until dawn laid a smudge of gray across the ceiling. He dreamed with his eyes open and saw a field of doors set into the ground like gravestones. In the dream, he walked between them and counted. He could not finish. The field did not end. The next day, he told himself he would leave. He packed a bag with shirts and socks and the metal photo frame of his parents on a motel patio near Lake Erie. He called his friend Victor, who worked nights as a guard at the warehouse, and asked if he could crash on his couch for a few days. Victor said yes, though he sounded worried by the request, and he told Daniel to arrive after midnight when his shift ended. At 7:15 p.m., Daniel turned his lock, shouldered his bag, and stepped into the hall. He saw fresh footprints on the thin carpet. Bare footprints, long and wet, moving away from his door and toward the far end. There were no return prints. At the far door, the footprints faded and stopped. The handle was wet. There was no water anywhere else. He left by the back stairs. The alley behind the house held 2 trash cans and the ghost of a vegetable garden that had never taken. The sky threatened more rain. He cut across 2 blocks toward the bus stop. As he walked, he passed a storefront with a narrow display of lamps and secondhand dishes, and in the glass he saw the reflection of the back of his head. Behind his reflection, though, behind the glass, in the store that should have been locked and dark, he saw a door with a tall, thin frame. It stood where no door should be. It stood the way a finger points in reprimand. He did not turn to look. He kept walking and kept his eyes on the gutter where rain gathered and slithered. He took the late bus. He tried to read. The lights in the bus hummed and dipped. A man, 2 seats back, muttered that everyone should sit down and be quiet, even though everyone was already sitting and no one was talking. Daniel got off near the river where the warehouse stood like a row of gray teeth. He waited for Victor by the back entrance under a buzzing yellow light. At 12:02 a.m., the side door opened and Victor waved him in with a quiet nod. They walked past cages stacked with boxes and the whine of a forklift that was bored with its job. Victor asked if he was all right. Daniel said the house felt wrong and he needed a few days away. Victor said he could stay as long as he wanted, that his couch had a good view of a boring wall, and sometimes a boring view could heal things that moved too fast. They reached the small security office. Daniel set his bag down and leaned against the metal desk. Then he heard it again. 3 slow knocks. Not on the warehouse door, not on a wall. From behind the metal cabinet in the office where no door could hide, Victor heard it too. He narrowed his eyes and walked to the cabinet. The sound came again. 3 knocks that rolled down the metal like water. Victor put a hand on the cabinet and yanked it away from the wall. Behind it was nothing but cinder block, cold gray squares, and mortar like dry bones. Victor swore and shoved the cabinet back. He stood still for a long moment, the way a dog stands when it hears something you cannot. Then the office light blinked and came back, and he looked at Daniel and did not smile. They left together at 2:04 a.m. and walked to the parking lot. The river moved like heavy glass. A fog bank drifted near the pilings. Victor drove while Daniel watched the rearview mirror. Streetlights passed in even intervals. On the third light, Daniel realized that each time the car rolled under the glow, he saw a tall black rectangle standing in the reflection, as if a door had been placed behind the back seat and bent the mirror as it passed. He did not look back. He watched the mirror and kept his hands flat on his thighs. Victor lived in a basement apartment under a dentist office on Maple Street. The walk down the short set of steps felt like a dive. The air smelled like coffee grounds and old magazines. The couch faced a small television and a shelf of paperbacks. Daniel sat and tried to slow his breathing. At 3:11 a.m. The sound came from the hallway outside, the simple and terrible shape of 3 knocks, and Victor went to the door with a baseball bat and flung it open. The hallway was empty. A draft slipped over his shoes and ran past Daniel on the couch as if something had been waiting to be invited. Victor shut the door and slid the chain and stood with his mouth open, then walked to the couch and put the bat down and said they would get a priest or a contractor in the morning, he did not care which. Morning did not help. The day stood gray and slack. Victor called a cousin who knew a handyman, who knew a carpenter, who had a story about a walled-up passage in a row house in Reading. The carpenter came at 1:02 p.m. with a belt of tools and a calm face. He listened while Daniel said what he could. He nodded the way people nod when they decide to accept things. They can move toward the part where they fix it. He went to the old boarding house with them. He stood at the end of the second-floor hall and looked at the tall, thin door that waited without impatience. He took a small square of mirror from his pocket and held it in the opening when Daniel turned the key and moved the door a few inches. The carpenter watched the mirror with a still face. The mirror did not show darkness. The mirror did not show anything. It did not show the hall behind them. It stayed blank. He closed the mirror and said that sometimes there are doors that are not doors, sometimes there are holes that were not dug, and sometimes a house is built over something that does not agree. He ran his palm down the frame and felt where the wood had been sanded, then scarred, then sanded again. He said there was an old story in towns like this about a set of steps with 11 risers and a 12th riser made of empty space. People would count and be satisfied, then put a foot down and fall where there was no step. He said there were also stories about men who bricked up their sins and slept sound after, until one night the mortar breathed. He set his bag down and took out a pouch of salt and a small mason line and a chalk plum. He had learned the habit from a mason who drank black coffee at dawn and swore that chalk lines remember the world the way it should be. He hung the plum by the frame, the string shook, the weight turned slow circles and would not settle. He asked for a hammer. Daniel brought the burned one from the porch, untouched since the delivery. The carpenter frowned at the black marks on the handle and did not use it. He used his own. He set 3 screws into the frame and 3 into the door and tied them to the line. He ran salt along the threshold until it looked like surf. He told Daniel to leave the door closed, locked, and tied, and to keep a light burning through the night so he could see if the line broke. He said he would return in the morning with a proper plate and a brace. He said to call if the salt moved. He stepped back and looked weary suddenly, like the room had taken a small bite of him, and he left with a quiet nod. At 2:09 a.m., Daniel woke to a soft hiss. He sat up and saw the salt rolling back from the threshold as if an invisible tide was pulling it inward. The string shook. The screws sang, a tiny metal whine like a sound a child could hear when a television is on. He stood and held the key and did not know what to do. The string snapped with 3 sharp tings. The screws turned. The door eased open, not toward him, but toward the dark that hungrily accepted it. He might have turned and run. He did not. He pressed the door closed with both hands and braced his feet and felt something on the other side pushing back with a slow, patient strength. He said, "Please stop." He did not even know to whom he spoke. The pressure eased. He turned the key. He leaned his forehead against the paint and stayed there until light began to creep around the window shade like a spy. He called the carpenter at 7:04 a.m. The call rang and rang. He left a message and waited. He called again, no answer. At noon, he walked to the corner store to buy coffee and bread and found a small crowd gathered by the alley. A police cruiser sat with its lights quiet but its engine running. 2 officers stood near a man on the ground with a sheet over his chest. The sheet was bright white against his boots that stuck out one end. A neighbor said the man had been found at dawn, stretched out near the dumpster, with a look like a person who left a task unfinished. Daniel felt the world narrow. He asked a woman in a scarf if she knew who it was. She said the man had a belt of tools on the curb. A leather pouch lay beside it with salt in the seams. A plumb bob sat under the bumper of a dirty sedan. Daniel said he needed air and he walked until he could not see the alley anymore. He did not return to the boarding house until evening. The door at the end of the hall waited. His own door stood where it should be now, as if the house had grown tired of the joke. He tried to pack again. He put the key in his pocket and told himself he would toss it into the river on the walk to the bus. As he zipped his bag, the room breathed cold. The window lowered by itself an inch and shut with a soft kiss. The lamp dimmed and brightened and dimmed again. He heard the knock. 3 steady raps, not from the hall, not from his door, but from inside his closet. He opened it with a small sound in his throat that could have been a laugh. The closet smelled like cedar and mothballs. An old coat that belonged to a tenant who never came back brushed his arm. The back of the closet did not hold a wall anymore. It held a tall, thin door, the same shape, the same handle. His head swam. He closed the closet and leaned his back against it and said the words he had read on the note. "You let me." He left that night at 10:27 p.m. He did not turn off the lamp. He did not lock his room. He went down the front steps where the porch sagged and turned left. The street looked longer than it ever had. He reached the corner and stopped. A man stood beneath the big sycamore that tilted over the curb. The man wore a coat that hung like a curtain. He faced away. He lifted a hand without moving his shoulder and knocked gently on the air in front of him. 1, 2, 3. The sound traveled to Daniel as if it had been made on wood near his ear. The man lowered his hand and walked across the street without looking left or right. He moved like a sleepwalker. Daniel took a step back. He went the other direction toward the church where the lights were always on for a little while after the hour. He did not pray. He sat in the last pew and watched the red exit sign burn like a coal and listened to the building creak as if it also had a spine and a set of tired ribs. The next morning, a city inspector arrived after a call that came from no one they could later identify. He wore a jacket with a seal and carried a clipboard with forms attached by a rusty clip. He walked through the house and looked at wiring and pipes and the water heater that rattled when it started. He reached the second floor. He paused at the end of the hall. He looked at the tall, narrow door as if reading a note in a language he almost remembered. He tried the handle. It did not turn. He wrote something on his form and left. On the way out, he told Ms. Whitcomb that old houses collect strange corners, and sometimes those corners collect a smell, and sometimes the smell is not a real smell but a memory of one. She nodded and smiled with her lips only. When he had gone, she climbed the stairs with a hammer and nails and a square of plywood. She stood at the door and waited. She did not raise the hammer. She walked back to her office and called a number she kept in a small book. No one answered that number either. The days after that did not break into clear pieces. Time smudged. He slept in fits. He saw the key in places he did not leave it. On his pillow, in the sink, inside his shoe like a small tongue. He took it to the river and threw it hard. It struck the water with a plunk that felt too small for the weight it carried. He watched the ripple widen and then close like a wound. He walked home and found the key sitting on his desk with the cord tied into a neat bow, as if someone with patient fingers had waited years to learn such a simple knot. Victor stopped by at 8:31 p.m. with 2 coffees and a man from his church who read quietly from a small book and asked to walk through the house with them. The man did not announce anything. He did not demand or command. He listened. He stood in the hall at the far door and said the place felt like a mouth pressed shut. He walked to the basement. The basement had a low ceiling and a strip of dirt floor near the far wall, where an old support post sank like a stake. The man crouched and touched the dirt and rose with a look of distant thought. He said he did not think the house was haunted in the simple way people like to say. He thought the house had been built over a path, like a country lane that had once run from one field to another. The lane did not end when the field was plowed. It kept going under what came after. He said some paths want travelers, some doors want to be used. He said someone long ago had opened a door here and did not shut it correctly. He said someone had tried to build a wall where a door did not want to be. He said none of this was about belief. It was about the shape of a wound and the way it will not close if a piece of it is missing. He asked Daniel what he had heard first. A knock, Daniel said. 3 knocks. The man nodded. He said 3 knocks are polite, they are the old way. They mean a traveler is asking permission. He said the worst thing you can do is open the door when the traveler has asked, and you do not know who it is. If you open, you become a host. If you refuse, the traveler goes on. He looked at Daniel with eyes that had watched factory smoke for years and said that sometimes the host does not know he has become one until the first guest is already in the kitchen. That night, Daniel tried to follow orders. He placed the key in a bowl of salt. He drew a line of chalk across the threshold of his room and across the far door. He set a chair under the knob. He sat and waited. At 1:03 a.m., the chair slid quietly aside and settled a foot away, as if a careful hand had pushed it and did not want to scratch the floor. The chalk line broke without footsteps crossing it. The key rose an inch in the bowl and rested again as if nodding. The door in the hall did not move. The closet door inside his room did. He heard a breath, slow and deliberate, in a space that could not hold anyone. The breath did not rush. It took its time. It sounded like a tide that had finally decided which way it meant to go. He left a recording on his phone for whoever might come next. He spoke into the small microphone with his voice pulled tight. He said he was sorry for whatever he had done, even if all he had done was turn the knob of a door in a hallway that should have been boring. He said he did not believe in curses. He said he believed in mistakes. He said he felt like a man who had signed a contract written in invisible ink. He left the phone on the desk with the recording playing, on repeat, like a small litany. In the morning, the landlady knocked on his room and called his name. He did not answer. She opened the door and stepped in and felt a chill ripple her skirt. The lamp was on, the bed was unmade. The phone on the desk whispered the last line of his recording over and over in a thin loop. I did not mean to let you in. The closet stood open 2 inches. The far door at the end of the hall stood open a foot. A line of damp soil ran from the far door to the closet and stopped dead at the sill. The bowl of salt sat empty, with a faint ring near its lip, as if something with many small hands had taken its measure. The police came and did what police do. They cataloged, they measured, they took photographs that flattened the room into rectangles and squares. Officer Nolan walked down to the basement and stared at the strip of dirt and came back up and wrote that the ground smelled like a place beside a river after a flood. He stood by the far door and looked into the dark that did not show the hall reflected in his pupils, and he decided to step away. The report said missing person. The report said no sign of forced entry. The report said the tenant had been under stress. The report did not say that Nolan woke that night at 3:11 a.m. in his own home to the sound of 3 polite knocks that came from inside the linen closet, and he lay still until the knocks moved on like a traveling show. Weeks passed without weeks passing at all. A new tenant toured the building and said he liked old wood and cheap rent. He took Daniel's room. He lasted 3 nights. He left a note under the rent box that said sorry and 2 jackknives on the table, as if the color of their handles had been a promise he wanted to keep. A woman who taught at the middle school moved into Nora's old space and smiled at the stairwell like an actress who believes in second chances. She told a colleague that the house hummed like a distant generator even when the power was steady. She told no one that her alarm shifted to 2:13 a.m. and stayed there no matter how she set it. She left during a rain on a Tuesday afternoon with a single backpack and a plant under her arm that shook as if a breeze was in the hall, but there was no breeze in the hall. The landlady started to sleep on a cot in the office downstairs because the phones rang without calls, and she decided she would rather be the first to hear than the last. She opened the ledger and ran a finger down the old page where the house deeds were copied out for no good reason except that someone had liked the look of handwriting. She found an entry about a previous owner who had poured concrete in the crawl space and then broken it up with a sledge when the water would not run right. She found another entry about a boarder who spoke to the wall in the laundry room and said the wall spoke back with a voice, like a voice in a metal pipe. She closed the ledger and told herself stories about plumbing and air and a bad memory that walks in circles. At dawn, she raised the blinds and found a small brass key on the windowsill with a tag that said, "For you." She went very still and did not touch it until noon when she put on a pair of gloves and used 2 fingers to flick it into the trash. She took the trash out to the can and set the lid and walked inside and locked the back door. When she returned to the office, the key sat on the desk with the cord in a new bow that no one had tied. On a night with a clear sky and a slow moon, a group of teenagers dared one another to throw pebbles at the boarding house and run. They stood under the sycamore and whispered the way teenagers do. They were not cruel. They only wanted to feel their hearts rise. They crept along the fence and raised their arms, and at that exact moment, a soft knocking sound came from the fence itself. 3 polite raps that carried the texture of wood, though the fence was iron. They broke and ran. All but one who stood with his mouth open like a fish, because at the end of the second-floor hall, a door was open, and in the dark behind it, a figure stood. The figure looked tall, but also wrong, as if the lines of the body had been drawn with a rule that did not match the human sketch. The figure raised a hand, the knock came again. The boy ran so fast, he left his shoes. A year did not pass, because we will not count years. The house gathered dust in the places no one cleaned. The porch leaned a little more. The door at the end of the second-floor hall sometimes stood ajar for no one, and sometimes closed itself with a courtesy that felt like a joke. When a storm rolled up the valley, the house held its breath, and the lights in the kitchen flickered and stilled, and for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator showed its true note, and you could hear the shape of something that had been here longer than wires or motors or rain. Detective Reed, who was older than his haircut and younger than his eyes, stopped by every few months to ask if anyone had heard from the missing tenant. He stood at the foot of the stairs and looked like a man waiting for a train that would never come to this platform. He took notes that he did not keep. He asked the same questions. He did not ask about doors. One day, he sat alone in his sedan outside the house and watched the second floor windows for an hour. At 3:11 p.m., when the street was quiet and a dog barked twice and then thought better of it, he saw a shape slide past the far window and pause. The shape did not move like a shadow made by a person. It moved like the afterimage in your eye when you stare at a light and then look away. He started the engine and drove to the municipal lot and sat with his head in his hands until the sensation passed that a set of steps was missing beneath his feet and he would fall if he tried to stand. There are people who believe they are too practical to be lost. They do not understand that a path that runs under a house has no use for belief. The door at the end of the hall is still there. Most days it is only wood and paint, holding the quiet air of a staircase that does not exist. Some nights it is not only wood. On those nights, the hallway feels longer than it did at noon. The bulb burns with a halo. The carpet nap looks pressed in the shape of feet that stood and waited. When you stand there, if you are foolish enough to stand there, you will feel the air lean toward you. It will feel like the moment a stranger steps too close on a bus. Polite and invasive at the same time. You will hear nothing at first. Then you will hear 3 knocks. Then you will hear a voice that speaks like a man who will not raise his voice because he does not need to. People who live far away will say that doors do not work that way. They will say a story is a way for a house to make sense of its creaks. They will say a man named Daniel had a bad week and made a bad choice and then made another. They will be right and wrong in equal measure. What is true is this: he should have never opened that door. He did anyway. He did a simple thing, and the world made of wood and light and time turned a few quiet degrees. We do not always see the turn. We feel it. We wake at 2:13 a.m. because an old clock in an old place has decided that is the right time for a soft hand to try a knob. We hear 3 knocks that are polite because the old ways are more patient than we are. We tell ourselves to ignore them. We do. We do not. We stand up and walk to the hall and place our fingers on a piece of metal that is colder than it should be, and we turn and we learn that some doors do not open into rooms, they open into unfinished invitations. On certain quiet mornings, the landlady pauses at the mailboxes and believes she hears someone at the end of the hall speaking very softly. She thinks she hears a man apologizing. She thinks she hears him say he did not mean to be a host. She stands very still and swallows, and the sound goes away. She does not tell anyone. She checks the keys on the hook. There is one more key than there should be. She does not touch it. She turns the sign on the front door to no vacancy, even when she has 2 rooms free. She tells herself it is for safety. She tells herself that boarding houses work best when they are a little empty. She tells herself that one day she will take a hammer to that far door and break it into a pile of obedient boards. She tells herself many things. At 11:43 p.m., on nights when the rain moves sideways, she hears 3 slow knocks and looks up from her chair, and for a second, one small second that stretches, she thinks she will answer. If you visit Ashwood Drive and you stand under the sycamore and you look at the second floor window at the end of the hall, you might see nothing but the tired curtains sagging inward as if the house is swallowing. Or you might see a thin line darker than the rest, the seam of a door that is not quite shut. You might hear a knock, even if there is no wood within reach. You will be tempted to knock back. People are tempted by small rituals. Do not do it. Walk away while you can, walk to the corner, and do not look at your reflection in the storefront glass. If you do, you may notice a tall black rectangle standing where no door should be, and you may learn the trick too late. The trick is not that the door follows you. The trick is that once you have opened it, there is no place left where it is not. The house stands and waits. The train still calls with its low horn. The porch light still fails and returns when it wants. People still move in and out with boxes and hope. They tell one another that every town has a story like this. They say the names wrong and get the times mixed up. None of that matters. The rhythm is what matters. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 3 more. The whisper that sounds like breath pulled across brick. The cold metal of a knob at the end of a short walk that can take the rest of your life. The way a man speaks at the edge of a choice and thinks he has time to think. The way a door waits forever and never gets tired. He should have never opened that door. He did. And now, on certain nights, when the air is wet and the street is quiet and the hum of the wires makes your teeth buzz, you can stand very still and you will feel it. The world has a seam in it. Someone is on the other side of that seam with their knuckles raised, and they are polite, and they are patient, and they are calling on anyone who still believes a door is only wood. She answered the wrong call and disappeared. She answered the wrong call one quiet evening in late autumn, when the sky above the small town was a dull slate gray, and the streets had emptied out hours earlier. The air had turned cold enough that even the occasional car passing through left a trail of mist from its exhaust. Inside her modest single-story house at the edge of town, the lights were dim, a single lamp glowing in the living room, throwing a pale yellow halo across the worn rug. It was nearly 9:30 when the phone buzzed on the coffee table. She had been curled up on the couch, with a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, sipping lukewarm tea, fighting back the creeping stillness of the night. The number on the screen wasn't familiar. There was no name, no area code she recognized, only a sequence that didn't make sense. She almost ignored it, but something in her gut pushed her to answer. The moment she picked up, the line was filled with static. Not the usual background fuzz of a bad connection, but deep, layered static, like voices whispering from beneath the surface. She said hello twice, her voice shaking, and just as she was about to hang up, she heard her own name spoken. It wasn't loud, it wasn't slurred, it was whispered with chilling precision, as though the caller was right behind her, leaning in close enough to breathe against her ear. Her throat tightened. She asked who it was, but instead of an answer, the voice began murmuring in a language she couldn't place. The tone was guttural, uneven, broken by pauses that felt deliberate, like someone reciting something they weren't meant to. Then the sound cut, and the line went dead. She stared at the phone in her hand, her reflection warped in the dark screen. It had to be a prank. Some teenager with a voice filter or a wrong number crafted into something unnerving. She tried to laugh at herself for feeling rattled, but when she rose to check the doors, she found the back one slightly ajar. Just an inch, enough to let a draft creep inside. She distinctly remembered locking it earlier. She shut it firmly, bolted it, and told herself not to panic. Yet her body betrayed her. Her palms were sweaty, her heartbeat rapid, echoing in her ears, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Half an hour later, the phone lit up again. This time, the number looked stranger. Only 5 digits, nothing resembling a proper call ID. She froze, staring at it, hoping it would stop. But it rang, insistent, and without realizing it, she swiped to answer. The same voice returned, clearer now. It whispered her street name, then her house number. Each word dragged across her nerves like a blade. She wanted to hang up, but the voice grew closer, louder, until the hissing static transformed into what felt like breath. She slammed her thumb down and ended the call, tossing the phone onto the couch. The silence that followed was worse. Every tick of the clock was amplified. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like a roar. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, lungs working overtime. She tried calling her closest friend, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal, no bars, though her phone had worked fine earlier. She tried to distract herself with the television, flipping through channels, but nothing stuck. Her hands trembled around the remote. Then another notification appeared. A voicemail. Her phone hadn't even rung. With dread pressing down on her, she played it. The message was simple. A slow creak, unmistakable, of her back door opening. Her blood ran cold. She rushed into the kitchen, flashlight clutched in one hand, wrench in the other, heart beating so hard she thought it would give out. The door was closed, locked. The chain was still latched, But the floor below showed faint moisture, small patches of wetness, as though something cold had pressed against it. She backed away. She wanted to run outside, but she convinced herself again that it had to be a trick, some sick recording, maybe someone watching her from a distance. She moved room to room, shutting curtains, switching on lights, anything to drive the shadows out. At 10:47, another voicemail appeared. This one froze her in place. It was her own voice, distorted but undeniably hers, crying out, "Help me!" followed by dragging noises and silence. Her knees nearly buckled. She couldn't understand how it was possible. She checked the windows again, but each curtain concealed only the reflection of her terrified face. Then came a tapping. At first faint, then deliberate. Fingernails against glass. One tap, then another, then another. She turned with the flashlight, aiming it toward the back of the living room window. Nothing. Just condensation streaking down from the cold night. Unable to stay inside, she grabbed her keys and bolted for the front door. The night outside was suffocatingly quiet. No crickets, no dogs barking, no distant traffic. Just a silence so thick it felt alive. She got into her car, locked the doors, shoved the key into the ignition. The engine refused to start. She tried again and again until finally the car roared awake. Relief lasted only seconds. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The same strange number. She ignored it, gripping the wheel, speeding out onto the deserted road. The phone continued ringing, vibrating against the leather seat. Against every ounce of will, she glanced at the screen. This time, the call wasn't from the strange number. It displayed her own name as the caller ID. Her heart lurched. She swerved slightly, fumbling for control. The road a blur beneath her headlights. The ringing stopped. Then another voicemail appeared. She pressed play with trembling hands, and what she heard nearly made her lose control of the car. It was the sound of her own vehicle's engine, humming exactly as it was at that moment. Over it, faint and shaky, was her own voice gasping for air. Not a recording from earlier, it was happening as she listened. She slammed the brakes, pulling to the shoulder, clutching the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. She shut the phone off completely, shoved it into the glove box, and sat in darkness. The world around her felt heavier, as though the night itself had folded in. That was the last time anyone saw her. 2 days later, her car was found abandoned on a remote stretch of highway bordering the woods. The driver's door hung open, the keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay her phone, battery dead, screen black. Investigators powered it on. Dozens of unheard voicemails filled the inbox. Most were blank, filled only with faint breathing. But the last one was different. It carried a voice, low and final, whispering, "You shouldn't have answered." Police scoured the area, dogs were brought in, but the trail vanished at the tree line as though she had stepped into the woods and simply disappeared. There were no footprints beyond the ditch, no sign of struggle. Her disappearance spread quickly through the town, whispered about in diners and gas stations. Some dismissed it as an abduction, a planned escape, or foul play from someone she knew. But others believed the calls weren't human at all. Neighbors recalled the night she vanished. One swore they heard a woman screaming faintly from the woods around 11, though the sound cut off too suddenly, as though swallowed by the trees. Another claimed to have seen a tall shadow near her driveway earlier that evening, a shape that didn't match any person they knew. The phone records were stranger still. Investigators traced the calls, but none of them had a proper origin. The numbers were malformed, non-existent. The voicemails showed timestamps, but no originating tower. A technician who reviewed them late at night reportedly refused to continue after listening. He never told anyone what he heard, only saying it was wrong, that the recordings didn't sound like anything a phone should be able to capture. Her family clung to the hope she might return, that she had fled to escape someone or something. But weeks turned into months, and no trace of her was ever found. The case went cold. The phone, locked away in an evidence box, still carried the corrupted voicemails. To this day, officers who handled it claim the device would sometimes power on by itself, showing missed calls at random hours, always from the same incomplete number. People in the town avoid answering late-night calls from unknown numbers. A kind of folklore grew around it. They say if your phone rings past midnight and the ID is incomplete, you must never answer. Because if you do, the voice on the other end won't be a stranger. It will be your own, whispering from somewhere you can't reach, pulling you closer until you disappear, just like she did that night. And now, whenever the phone rings in that quiet town after dark, even the bravest admit their hearts skip a beat. Because everyone remembers the woman who answered the wrong call and was never seen again. The basement that should have stayed locked. The house at the corner of Maple Street had a way of shrinking the world around it. The sycamores leaned close over the roof. The sidewalk dipped as if the ground itself did not want to pass in front of the porch. Even in summer, when the rest of town hummed with lawnmowers and late baseball games and the soft pulse of cicadas, that address seemed to breathe in a different rhythm. People crossed the street without thinking. Eyes forward, steps quick. They said it was a shame about the Kellers. They said it was better not to dwell on things that would not come back. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Thomas moved to town at the start of a thick, humid stretch, the kind of air that left fingerprints on glass. He rented a basement apartment behind the old laundromat on Birch Avenue and took a night job stocking at the big box store by the highway. It suited him to work while the town slept. Less traffic, fewer faces to read. He told himself he liked the quiet of empty aisles and the steady logic of boxes that needed to be where they belonged. On a Tuesday after midnight, he cut down Maple on the walk home, backpack slung on one shoulder, shoes whispering against the cracked pavement. There was nothing unusual about the night at first. A single porch light, 3 houses away. A distant train horn sliding through the humid dark. He would remember with certainty the exact moment his feet stopped. It was 12:41 a.m. He checked his phone because the time felt like a pin fastening a page to the wall. In the dirt strip beneath the Keller house windows, a thin rectangle of glass at ground level exhaled a second of light from below. Not a passing car, not a reflection. It pulsed once, pale and cold, and died. He kept walking for 6 steps, told himself it was an appliance dying, a battery coughing its last breath. He turned at the end of the block and came back. The light flashed again from the cellar window, a longer glow, a little brighter, as if something below ground struck a match and held it close to stone. He listened then. The night seemed to hold its breath with him. 3 heartbeats, then a knock from beneath the earth. 1 knock, a pause, a second. The sound traveled through the dirt and into his legs. He told himself a raccoon had gotten into the crawl space. He told himself the stories were small-town shadows stretching for attention. He stepped off the sidewalk into the brittle grass. The front steps creaked under him. The rusting handle turned with a tired sigh. Inside, the smell hit him. Wet paper, cold iron, a memory of bleach that had never reached the places that mattered. The hallway pressed in. Wallpaper peeled like old bandages. A fan of dust trembled in his phone light. He moved past a living room that still held a couch in a shape that remembered backs and elbows. He moved past a dining room where the table wore a skin of gray and the chandelier hung 1 bulb short like a missing tooth. He found the basement door at the end, a door different from the others. Heavy planks, newer than the rest of the wood. A thick chain threaded through iron eye plates. A busted padlock with teeth marks of rust. He put his ear to the seam. The cold rolled out through the slit and slid over his face. The knock came again, close to where his ear pressed. He flinched. The chain rattled. He pulled the door an inch, and the basement pulled back with a breath he could feel but not hear. The stairs were narrow and damp. Stone walls waited below, black where water wept. He took each step with the flat of his foot, testing for rot. The beam of his phone shivered. It brushed old jam jars on a shelf seeded with white dust. It found a workbench, a coil of rope, a saw with a smile of missing teeth. It found the walls, symbols carved into stone, not careful or pretty, hard and fast, deep where the chisel slipped, circles with tails, lines joined in knots. Rough figures standing in groups of three. Some of the marks were dark with something that had dried and once had weight to it. He said his own name inside his head as a way of not saying the word leave. He swept the light in a slow arc, and there on a table, warped by damp, lay a leather-bound book the color of old coffee. He touched it. The cover stuck and then let go. The first pages were full of the same figures he saw on the walls. Then writing began. English that tilted up to the right. He read a line and did not understand. He read the next and did. Keep it locked. Do not open. Keep it locked and it will not leave the hole. Keep it locked and it will not know your name. The scratching started above him, a long rag of sound drawn slow over wood. He pointed the light up the stairs. The door at the top trembled as if a draft breathed through the house. The scratching crossed the door. It became a pushing. The chain groaned. He grabbed the book and backed toward the far wall, where two cinder blocks looked new against the age of the stone. He saw then a patch the size of a window that had been bricked over with unusual care. Mortar smoother than the rest. No gaps, no cracks. He felt a small wind where no wind should be, and the phone light flicked once. He held the book like a shield and moved. He reached the stairs by feeling with his shins. The chain lifted and rattled as if hands unseen were testing it from the other side. He shoved the door with his shoulder and swung the chain back into place. He pressed his palm flat to the wood. It pressed back with a softness like the throat of a sleeping animal. He did not run out of the house. He walked because running would have turned the hallway long as a tunnel and the porch a mile away. Outside, on the sidewalk, he swallowed the warm night like medicine. He held the book under his arm and did not look back until he reached the corner. When he did look, the basement window was dark again. He told himself out loud that he would return the book the next day. He told himself he did not believe anything the book needed him to believe. He lived with the book on his small kitchen table because placing it anywhere else made the apartment lean. He made coffee and put the book beside the mug. He slept in the early morning and dreamed of wooden stairs under a lake at 3:17 p.m. As he folded a shirt, he heard a thud in the floor, soft like a hand laid flat against a door from the other side. He froze. He told himself a truck outside had bounced over a pothole and the sound had traveled through the concrete. He waited. 10 seconds. Then another soft thud from under the kitchen linoleum. He stepped backward and regretted that his apartment was below ground level. He stepped backward again, and his heel touched the carpet runner that led to his own basement door. He stood at the top of his stairs for a long time with his palm on the knob and the book under his arm. The thud did not come again. He told himself he had imagined it. He told himself that the sound under his feet belonged to pipes and old buildings and air. That night at work, he stacked boxes of toothpaste and bleach and dog food, and the aisles felt longer. At 2:08 a.m., his supervisor asked if he was all right. He said he was fine and realized the words had the weight of someone trying to remember whether they had turned off the stove. By Friday, he had read enough of the journal to understand the shape of the story without the dates he chose not to see. The Kellers had bought the house and learned immediately not to spend time in the basement. The writing made small circles around details and then slid off. They heard things. They saw light where there should not be light. They slept with the windows locked, even in heat. The handwriting changed halfway through the book. The second hand pressed harder, the loops taller, as if the letters needed to take up more room to be louder than the sound from beneath. Keep it locked. Do not put your ear to the door. Do not say your name at the top of the stairs. If you step down with a partner. Do not argue on the stairs. The last page before the leather cracked into the binding had a list. Fix the hinge on the chain plate. Replace the lock when the moon is full. Fill the gap under the door with salt and sugar. When it whispers the names of your dead, do not answer. When it says it is cold, do not answer. When it says it will be quiet if you let it breathe, do not answer. On Saturday morning at 10:27, the metal chair at his kitchen table trembled as if a truck passed outside. The walls did not shake, the glass in the cabinet did not clink, only the chair. He lifted the seat and found 3 grains of coarse salt lined up as if someone had placed them there on purpose. He thought of a prank he could not explain. He swept the grains into his palm and threw them into the sink. That night at 3:03, the radio in his bedroom turned on by itself and hissed a long breath of static. The sound rose and fell. Not a station, not a pattern that made sense. It felt like listening to someone breathe through their teeth on the other side of a heavy curtain. He went to the library because daylight often reduces the size of things in the mind. The local history corner, tucked by the genealogy shelves, held a rolled map of the town from before the highway. A librarian with a name badge that said Mara showed him the index cards for property deeds. He found Keller in pencil and someone else before them, and a gap after. He found a smaller box of clippings that smelled of old basement and lemon cleaner. One article mentioned a boy lost near the river. Another followed a string of break-ins where nothing was taken except photographs from frames. A short column explained that the church on Cedar had once tried to organize a community prayer at the Keller house, but canceled when two of the volunteers fell ill on the front steps. The paper avoided words like curse. It used words like unfortunate and ongoing. The librarian lowered her voice to ask if he had known the family. He said no. He asked if anyone had been allowed into the basement when the house was boarded. The librarian paused and said she did not know, and then said she had never seen anyone go in or out for years. On the way home, he stopped at Riggs Hardware and bought a new padlock and a loop of chain and a bag of rock salt because the journal had given him a list, and lists could be useful even when they came from the wrong rooms. He sat at a small table and felt the cool paper of the receipt in his hand and thought about how unreasonable it was to be comforted by an itemized list. He made a plan in slow breathing. He would go back at dusk when the street held more sound. He would put the lock on the chain properly. He would not go down the stairs. He would leave the book under the heavy slab of a toolbox borrowed from the stockroom because the idea of returning the book felt like pulling a nail from a beam that had never squeaked until someone touched it. At 6:12, he stood on the Keller porch with the bag of salt in his left hand and the chain in his right. The door opened like a mouth too willing. The hallway felt the same, the air did not. He could smell metal as clearly as if a handful of pennies had warmed in his palm. He reached the basement door and found the chain as he had left it, but the lock lay on the floor with its body intact and its shackles straight as a finger. The shear had not been made by a tool. He told himself he did not have time to invent what it had been made by. He wound the new chain through both plates and snapped the lock closed. He poured a line of salt along the seam at the bottom of the door. He sprinkled a handful across each stair, and the tiny crystals clicked like sleet. He kept his breathing slow and shallow because he could hear his own breath, and he did not want to hear anything else inside his breath. He left the house and walked to the end of the block and turned around in the middle of the street. He wanted to see whether anything about the house had changed now that he had done something inside it. The sky was a bruised blue, the windows were dull eyes, a single mosquito drifted around his knee, and then the basement window flashed again with a colder light than fluorescent bulbs or phones. He took a step back. The light winked out. He whispered the address in his head and felt the number fall through him like a key. Sunday bled into Monday with thin sleep and thick coffee. He went to work and stocked shampoo and paper towels and metal shelving pins. He tried to think about nothing except the shape of each thing in his hands. On break, he watched the bakery workers frost cupcakes behind glass and imagined a town where basements contained only spiders and paint cans. At 1:59 a.m., his phone vibrated against his thigh where he had set it on a stack of cardboard. The screen lit the inside of the receiving bay like a small moon. No name, no number, just the words withheld and a line of silence when he put it to his ear. He said hello and heard his own breath return twice slower and twice colder than he had sent it out. On Tuesday afternoon, he heard a knock in his own basement. Not a thud, not a settling of the building, a single knock. Then another, the same 2 count as the house on Maple. He walked down his own stairs with the book tucked next to his ribs. The air smelled of dust and laundry soap and something a little sour that might have been old water. He stood with his hand on the light chain, but did not pull it. He told the basement he could hear it. He told the basement he would not open the door at Maple again. He said his own name softly in the middle of a sentence because words can carry names when you slip them safely. At 3:07 a.m., he woke to the radio. Hiss again. And this time, the static had a pattern, like words muffled under a blanket. He listened and told himself what he heard was only the shape of language and not language. Then a word formed that he knew to be his name, even though it did not sound like his name spoken by any person he had ever met. It sounded like someone had written his name on a piece of paper and set that paper on a table and dragged a fingernail under the letters over and over until the paper had worn thin. He took the book to work because he did not want it in the apartment while he slept, and he did not want it in the locker in the break room where other hands might open it. During the quiet part of the shift, he sat on a forklift with the book on his lap and read. The later pages were not entries. They were sentences, like nails. Do not make bargains in the stairwell. Do not agree to anything from the landing. It will tell you that it is not your problem. It will tell you that the ones who kept it locked were cruel. It will tell you that the light in the window means it is weak. It will tell you that if you open the door, it will leave through the front and never return. When you hear it say a name you knew once, understand that it is not that voice and that the person it belongs to is not on the stairs waiting for you to help. He decided to ask someone in uniform for advice, not help. Advice seemed smaller. He walked into the police station on Wednesday, just after noon, and asked at the front desk whether there had been calls about Maple Street. The desk sergeant put his elbows on the counter and said people called about that block every few months, kids and dares and noises. He wrote down the address and nodded to a map on the wall and said a patrol car would swing by. The sergeant asked whether Thomas was a relative of the previous owners. Thomas said no. He said he was concerned about a vacant property and the possibility of people getting inside. He did not mention the journal. He did not mention the marks on the wall. He did not mention how sleep had begun to feel like a room with an unlocked door facing downhill. Later that day, he met Nolan from the stockroom for coffee at the diner with the neon clock in the window. The server called them honey and set down 2 mugs and a plate with pie that tasted like nutmeg and sugar. Thomas told him enough of the story that Nolan's eyes got wide and then smaller, and then Nolan laughed and said a man has to find a better hobby than breaking into houses. Thomas smiled because the conversation felt like folding a blanket neatly after a storm. Nolan said he would walk past the place with him after work for a thrill. Thomas said no very quickly and then softer. Nolan shrugged and said he did not scare easily. Thomas said it was not fear that mattered, it was attention. Some places grew when you looked at them. That night, after the shift ended, they did not walk down Maple. They took Birch and went directly to their apartments. Thomas watched through the blinds until he saw Nolan's living room light come on 2 buildings down. He let his breathing go long and slow. At 2:26 a.m., a thud shook the thin wall between Thomas and the laundry room. Then a sound like someone dragging cardboard across concrete. He stood, and the floor felt like the deck of a boat. He pressed his palm to the wall, and the wall hummed like a tuning fork. He thought of the bricked patch in the Keller cellar and the way the mortar had looked newer, even though nothing in that house should qualify as new. At 2:31 a.m., he heard footsteps on Birch. 2 sets, one heavier and one soft and quick. He looked through the blinds again. Nolan walked fast toward Maple with his phone held like a lantern. Beside him, a shorter shape kept pace. Thomas pulled on shoes and grabbed nothing else because everything else felt like it would slow him down. By the time he reached the corner, Nolan was already on the front steps with the door open, and the shorter figure had slipped inside. Thomas swallowed the taste of metal and followed. The hallway did not so much welcome them as forget to stop them. At the basement door, the chain lay in a loose curve on the floor, and one end of it was black as if it had spent time in smoke. The door leaned off its swollen frame, and in the gap, Thomas could see the top 3 stairs like vertebrae in a spine. Nolan said he had heard his sister's voice on the phone. He said the voice had stopped speaking when he stood near his kitchen sink, and then he had heard it at his back, as if the phone had turned into a mouth. He said she had sounded like she had when they were little and scared on storm nights. He said she had asked him whether he remembered the basement of their childhood home and the way he would count the steps out loud to calm her. He said he had come to count these steps and make a joke of it. He said he would call her as soon as he showed the scary old house that he could walk downstairs without shaking. The shorter figure that had slipped inside had gone down ahead of him. Thomas did not see it then, in a way his mind would let him examine. He would decide later that there are shapes meant only to be noticed by the back of the eyes. He reached out and placed his palm on Nolan's forearm. The skin was cold, as if he had been outside in winter. Nolan looked at him, and the look was the look of a man who has already decided to do a thing and is only waiting to be allowed to begin. Thomas saw the strange softness in the corners of his mouth. He said they would stand on the landing only. He said they would count to 10 and then go up again. He said they would not say any names. He said they would not answer anything they heard. They stepped down. The air on the stairs did not feel like cold air. It felt like the absence of a smell and the absence of warmth and the absence of a sound hitting a wall and returning. The light from their phones found the same jam jars and the same workbench and the same carved symbols. It found the bricked patch. It found scuff marks in the dust where something had traced a circle around the table and then stopped and then traced a circle in the opposite direction. The radio hiss came from nowhere and everywhere. Under it, other noises rose like small things in a drawer trying to slide to the front. They stood on the landing. They counted. 1 to 10 took longer than it should and shorter than they wanted. As they reached 9, a voice rose from the bottom stair, thin with distance but near his breath. It said a word like help, elongated to twice the length that word normally wears. Nolan's face changed like a surface when a reflection moves across it. Thomas gripped Nolan's forearm where the pulse tapped hard. He said the list in the book again. Do not answer. Do not bargain. Do not take a single step down after you promised yourself you would not. At 9.5, the voice said a different sound. Not help. A nickname Thomas understood to belong to a boy in a kitchen long ago. Nolan almost laughed because happiness and grief sometimes look the same when they arrive at exactly the wrong time. He leaned forward 1 inch and the stair under his foot clicked the way wood does when it admits weight. Something turned its head at the bottom. The air tilted. Thomas dragged him back with both arms and hit the door with his shoulder and swung it closed and shoved the chain through with fumbling hands. The thing on the other side stepped up 3 stairs with the sound of 1 step. The door pushed against his back like a slow wave. The chain pulled against the plates. The lock took his shaking and held. He and Nolan stood with their foreheads almost touching because there was nowhere else to look. Nolan's eyes watered as if he stood in bright sunlight. The pushing against the door stopped, but the sound did not. The sound became a long, soft rubbing against wood. Then nothing. Then a knock. The same one, and then 2. The heavy breath passed into the hall and receded. He did not listen at the seam. He walked backward with the book tucked to his chest and the lock pinched in his fingers like a coin. Outside the night was not a relief. The sky hung still as the inside of a cupboard. They walked without speaking to Birch. When they reached Nolan's building, he said he would call his sister. He said he would not tell her where he had been. His mouth trembled like the waterline of a lake when a boat has long gone by. Thomas nodded and did not say, "Be careful," because words turn into loose nails when you need beams. He went home and sat on his kitchen floor and leaned his head against the cabinet. He fell asleep there for a few minutes or an hour. He woke to his phone, flashing a sliver of light on the ceiling and buzzing without a name. He did not answer. The book lay on the linoleum, open to the page with the list. He traced 1 line with a finger until the letters warmed under his skin. He stood and filled a bowl with salt and went to his own basement door and poured a thin white seam. He whispered that he would keep the door closed because there are doors you close for your own safety, and there are doors you close for the safety of others, and sometimes they are the same door. On Thursday, in the wet heat of afternoon, he found Mara, the librarian, at her desk. He asked a different question. He asked whether she knew anything about a bricked area in the Keller cellar. She swallowed and said she did not, and then she did the thing a helpful person does when small talk is no longer a good coat. She said her uncle had done drywall for the town years ago and had gone to the Keller place once. He had refused to step below the top stair. He had come home and said he had felt a small wind blowing on his fingers from under the door like the breath of something close to the floor. He had said a family before the Kellers had built a wall to hide a well that had once been in the cellar, a well that did not lead to groundwater, a well that led to something else. The town had filled wells before. Old ones that calves fell into or that swallowed loose ash. They had never filled that one with dirt. They had put stones and boards across it and then built a wall to force themselves to forget. Thomas thanked her and walked out into sun that felt like heavy milk. He bought a sledgehammer and a chisel at the hardware store because doing nothing had begun to feel like opening a door by standing very still near it. He told himself he would go at first light when the birds made a lot of honest noise. He told himself he would knock 3 bricks out and then decide what next to do. He told himself that breaking open the seal would be the first step to resealing it properly. He did not tell himself that people who open things often believe closing them will be much easier than it is. At 5:1 a.m. on Friday, he stood on the stairs to the Keller cellar with the sledge in both hands. He took 2 steps down and stopped because the air below smelled like wet pennies and old paper. He took 1 more step and planted his feet as if he stood in a canoe. He swung the sledge in a small, controlled arc because there was nowhere to widen. The head met the brick with a noise that felt like biting down hard on a fork. A shard dropped and skittered across the floor. He swung again. Mortar dust rose and lived in his nose and throat. A third swing loosened a brick the size of his hand. He pried it out and set it down, and his skin did not want to release it. The hole was a mouth as high as his shin and as wide as his palm. He put his ear near, but not to it. He heard nothing at first. He heard a sound, then like distant wind through trees. He realized there were no trees underground. He realized the sound was very quiet and very close, and not wind. He widened the hole by 1 more brick because stopping at 1 felt like a kind of insult that would be answered in a language he did not speak. Through the opening, the dark was not flat. It bent inward like the first step into an elevator shaft. A small rush of cold kissed his knuckles. The smell of iron deepened. He lifted his phone and put the light to the gap. The beam went 5 feet down and then met a shape that reflected light like wet glass. Water lay in a still black circle, waiting for the phone light to land on it so it could pretend to be the sky. A ring of old wood ended where the water began. Iron spikes rimmed the wood like teeth that had lost some but not all of their neighbors. They were wired together with thin strands of dark metal. Small bells dangled on 2 of the wires. He had seen such bells tied to doorknobs at Christmas in houses that wanted to be visited. Here, they were a warning for the inside, a stop for the upward motion of anything that wanted to climb. He heard then a note from one of the bells, so soft he might have dreamed it while awake. Not a jingle, a tart, faint sound like the first sound a glass makes when a finger finds it. He felt the stair under him tilt a hair. He stepped back and hit the wall with his shoulder, and the sledge swung low and knocked the edge of the table, and the leather book slid an inch and settled. He wanted to put the bricks back with gentle hands. He wanted to push them into place like the way you tuck a child into bed. He realized with a clarity that hurt that the wall had not been built to keep people away from the well. It had been built to make time pass more smoothly above it. He whispered, "Keep it locked," and the words did not feel like superstition. They felt like a simple instruction for a tool with teeth. He placed the first brick and the second, and his breath shortened as if he had been running. The mortar he had brought in a plastic tub went on with a butter knife, and the work looked clumsy and young next to the smooth line he had broken. He set the third brick and tapped it and heard the bell below speak again. It sounded like laughter that had not learned the joke. The room changed then, the way a room changes when another person steps into it behind you. He felt a small pressure at his lower back that might have been cold air climbing. He stood, and the phone light swung and found a wet track on the floor, leading from the bricked patch to the foot of the stairs, and then stopping as if a careful stopper had put a palm down and said no farther for now. He lifted the salt bag and poured a thick ribbon across the track. The grains hung in the air for a half second as if tasting, and then fell. He stepped to the door and pulled it shut and fed the chain through and clicked the lock. He pressed his head to the wood. The other side felt like a tongue pressed to the back of teeth. He kept Friday small. He sat in his apartment with the radio unplugged and the book on top of the refrigerator because the higher the object, the less likely it felt to reach up. At 3 a.m. The floor knocked under his feet twice. He said he heard it. He said he was not answering. He said his name inside a word that did not belong to him. Saturday felt like walking through someone else's house while they slept in the next room. At one point, 04 p.m., the laundromat dryer, 2 doors down, stopped mid-cycle and no quarters fell through the slot. He heard a sound like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. He ate a sandwich without tasting it. He fell asleep at 7 and woke at 11 because the building sighed, and then he realized that he had not heard the building sigh so humanly before. He walked to Maple and stood across the street in the empty midnight like a piece of furniture on the curb. The house wore its shadow evenly. A stray cat moved across the yard and did not glance at the window well. He went home and sat at the table and turned the book to the last page again. In pencil so faint he could have missed it, a final line waited. If it leaves the hole, it will not want to go far at first. It will want a basement with stairs. It can count. It will want a place. It can learn the shape of your footsteps. It will want to know the names you say when you are too tired to think. Give it none. Give it nothing. Give it back the dark. On Sunday evening, a storm rose the way summer storms do, angry in the distance and then in the living room all at once. Rain hit the sidewalk like rice. Lightning pressed white against the blinds. The basement under his apartment breathed cool and close, as if the storm had opened something in it. He considered calling someone and could not think who. He tried to imagine how he would explain a well that did not want water. He told himself he would give it back the dark, and he picked up the hammer he kept near his own door and the bag of salt and the book, because the book had been with him for each hour that mattered, and that kind of company counts for something. At 12:58 a.m., he stood again in the Keller hall. The chandelier strained with a seam of light from the storm. The basement door looked bigger and at the same time tight with its own edges. He placed the book on the first stair because some objects understand where they should be set. He ran his palm along the chain. He touched the lock. The wood felt dry under his hand even as rain sang outside. He opened the door only enough to breathe. He spoke to the dark the way you speak to a dog that is backed under a bed. He said he would bring bricks and new mortar tomorrow at noon. He said he would finish the job before the next sun slid down. He said he would not listen to anything but the sound of the trowel and the bell and his own counting. He said he would not be fooled by names in familiar shapes. The next morning, at 11:02, he stood in the aisle at Riggs and bought 2 bags of mix and a new trowel and a pair of gloves. The kid at the counter asked if he had a project. He said yes and then laughed because the word project landed like a paper airplane in a place where there was no air. He carried the buckets to Maple in 2 trips and felt each trip cut through the heat. He set the first bucket on the porch and then turned back for the second. When he looked again after crossing the street, the bucket had shifted an inch to the left toward the door. He did not go to it quickly. He walked slow and placed the second bucket next to the first, and both were still. He told himself that the porch was uneven and the wood had remembered how to be a ramp in rain. Before he could begin, he saw Deputy Hawkins step out of a cruiser and lift a hand. The deputy had a face that looked older when he was listening. He said there had been a noise complaint last night from 2 streets over. He asked whether Thomas was a contractor. Thomas said no. He said he was a neighbor. The deputy said the town was thinking of condemning the house for real this time and clearing the lot because of kids and fires and liabilities. He said they would get a crew in the next month. He asked whether Thomas had been inside. Thomas looked at the buckets. He looked at the deputy. He said the house had a problem, and it was old, and it did not save receipts. The deputy studied him the way a man studies a map he does not trust. He said to be careful and to call if he saw anyone else trying to go down there. He said the last thing he needed was a group of teenagers going missing because they like a dare. He drove off slowly, watching his mirrors. Thomas worked. He worked in the way that gets inside the skull and quiets it. He pulled 3 bricks and scraped the hole smooth and widened it to square. He looked down and saw the bells waiting like sleeping birds. He poured the first thin wall of mix and set in a brick and pressed. He heard a tiny note from the bell and set the next brick and pressed. He counted the seconds on his phone and pressed again. He waited for the line to take. He spread more and pressed, and when the sound came again, he said he did not hear it. The air thinned. The skin of his neck crawled as if a small hand tested his hair. He did not reach up. He set another brick. The first bucket emptied, and he fetched the second. He moved through the kitchen and imagined the Kellers cooking breakfast in a house that held itself tighter each day around them. He imagined a woman pressing a note into a book because the walls needed more words to stay closed. He returned to the hole, and the smell of iron had softened and the bells had gone quiet. He set 4 more bricks. He pressed with the flat of his gloved hand and felt the resistance of something that did not like to be touched, but did not know how to avoid it when it came from the right angle with the right pressure and the right not listening. By 2:49 p.m., the hole had become again a seam. His work did not match the old work, but it held the way 2 hands can hold, even when one is small. He poured thin salt water into the mortar and watched the line drink. He took the book and set it on the table and put both palms on the cover and said what he had learned to say. Keep it locked, do not answer. Give it back the dark. He walked up into the bright, hard day, and the world felt flat and real and ordinary in a way that made him almost giddy. He laughed once, and the laugh sounded like air finding a pocket that had been sealed. He locked the house door behind him and felt for the first time that the lock belonged to a house and not to a throat. The nights after that were not empty. Nothing goes back to what it was before. But the knocks in his own basement softened to the sound of a building remembering itself. The radio hissed once, and then never again. He slept 3 hours in a row, then 4. He left the book on a high shelf and did not touch it unless he had to move the ladder. He checked Maple each morning on his way home when the sun pressed yellow on the pavement. The basement window held nothing but his own reflection looking down. 2 weeks later, the town posted a bright notice on a stake in the front yard that said work order and a lot number and a date. A week after that, a crew in hard hats and shirts with logos put up a new fence with a padlock and took photographs and measured with a wheel. They nodded and ate sandwiches on the curb, and Thomas watched them leave with the slow relief of someone realizing that the storm had moved far enough away that thunder could be remembered as a story and not a present tense. The night before the demolition was scheduled, he woke at 3:11 a.m. with a clear thought sitting in his mind like a person in a chair. He dressed, he put on boots, he put the book in his backpack. He walked down Maple in the hush that happens before the first bird remembers to be a bird. He climbed the fence because the lock on a fence is a lock on a line, and sometimes a line wants to be stepped over. He stood on the porch and listened. Inside the house, the air smelled like wood and old sugar. The basement door waited with its chain and lock and seam of salt that had turned into a white ribbon glued to the floor by summer damp. He put his palm flat to the wood, and he could feel nothing there for the first time. No breath, no push, no distant bell. He unlocked the chain. He opened the door just enough to whisper the number of days since he had reset the wall. He said he had done what he could with the hands he had. He said the work would be loud tomorrow and then quiet. He said if silence could be a promise, he was making it as best he could. As he turned to go up, he heard a sound that did not make his stomach jump. A small clink like china being set gently on a shelf. He smiled and closed the door and set the chain without hurry. On the porch, he stood very still and looked at the first slice of gray behind the trees. He realized he was crying, small, silent tears like condensation. He wiped them away and did not bother to explain to himself why. The machines came mid-morning. A backhoe took the porch first, and the men shouted the easy words of work that goes as planned. When the bucket took the first bite of the front wall, a dark dust rose, and the driver lifted a hand for a brake while it cleared. Thomas stood across the street with coffee cooling in his hand. He told himself that someday this would be a flat lot with grass and perhaps a new house that would never teach its owners new meanings for the word below. The basement walls came last. The crew hesitated with the hole in the ground. They discussed a plan with gestures that did not reach the street. In the end, they filled the cavity with crushed stone and concrete. The driver said, if a man cannot see his reflection in a thing, it is less likely to think it is a mirror. The foreman laughed and shook his head. They smoothed the surface and left orange cones the way sailors leave lights. That evening, Thomas walked to the fresh slab and stood on it. The concrete held his weight without talking. He imagined the well under layers of stone and powder and weight. He imagined the bells caught forever in a mix of sand and water and Portland cement. He imagined that sound traveling up through solid rock and not finding any ears, because some sounds do not need to be heard to know that they have stopped. He went home and put the book in a box with a tight lid and carried it to a storage unit out by the highway where units sit like teeth in a long, quiet mouth. He signed the paper and set the box on a top shelf and felt the strange lightness that comes when you put something heavy where it belongs. Weeks passed. The town forgot in the way towns do. Someone painted the laundromat door a new blue. The neon clock at the diner stopped flickering. Maple Street at night smelled like cut grass and a little like gasoline when the crews moved their trucks. Thomas went to work at night and came home near morning. He counted the steps to his own basement sometimes as he passed the door, because counting can be a kind of prayer and a kind of promise. On a Sunday evening, in late heat and long shadows, he took a walk toward the river. On the way back, he felt the pull of the old address, and he turned down Maple so that he could confirm a thing he already knew. The lot where the house had stood was a smooth gray shape with a skin of dust and two small weeds already testing the edge. He stood at the curb and thought about how people say ground takes what you give it. He thought about how some gifts are heavy and some are not, and how sometimes the only difference is a chain and a lock, and a person who will set the chain again when it loosens. The night rose like a slow tide. The cicadas wound up. A car hissed past. He turned to go, and in the corner of his eye, he saw a pulse of pale light. He went very still. He let his head turn slowly until he looked square at the place where the old basement window had been. There was nothing there now but concrete the color of chalk. The light did not come from the ground. It came from the storm drain at the edge of the curb. A small square of water reflected something not present in the sky. It pulsed once, twice. It went still. He stood without moving. He did not lean closer. He did not speak to the water. He reached in his pocket and found 3 grains of salt that had worked their way into the seam of the fabric and lodged there for weeks. He dropped them at his feet and watched them vanish into the dust. At home, he sat at the table without turning on the light and listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the slow click of the cooling pipes. He waited for the radio that was not plugged in to make a noise, and it did not. He slept and dreamed of a field covered in frost that did not melt when the sun rose. He woke at 6:12 a.m., exactly without an alarm, and knew that sometimes a thing stays locked because a person decides each day to keep it that way. He did not go back to the storage unit for a long time. When he finally did, the box on the top shelf was as he had left it. He brought it down and set it on the concrete floor and touched the lid and then left it closed. He lifted the box and put it back in its place, because some stories work better as weight than as words. He walked out into heat that smelled like tar and rain. He breathed and felt the breath go all the way in and all the way out without catching on a nail or a bell or a stair. He went home on Birch and stepped over his own basement door the way a person steps over a sleeping dog. He remembered the list and understood that it was not a list of rules. It was a list of choices a person could lay out each day like tools. He turned on the coffee. He waited for it to finish. He stood and listened to nothing that he did not invite. He said a sentence without names and without bargains. He said the simple truth of the street and the house and the hole. Some doors must stay closed. Some doors are not doors. The basement on Maple taught him both. He keeps that lesson like a lock in the pocket of whatever he wears, cool to the touch, easy to hold, heavy enough to matter. And on nights when the air goes too quiet, he looks toward the part of town where concrete lies like a lid, and he counts to 10 very slowly, the way a person might count steps in the dark. He keeps counting until morning touches the windows. He keeps counting until the house inside him stays locked. He keeps counting until the world answers with nothing at all. A simple camping trip turned into pure horror. It began as an easy plan on a Thursday afternoon, a fast message thread among 5 friends who had not seen the stars together since college. The idea sounded clean and healthy. 2 nights in the Allegheny National Forest, a site near Kinsua Creek, a little fire, a lot of silence. Then home by Sunday evening with that clear air feeling in the lungs. Nolan booked the permit number by phone, Brooke double-checked the maps, June promised a new camp stove, Priya handled food, and Malik tossed in a first aid kit heavy enough to impress a wilderness guide. Everyone liked the balance of skills and the promise of a lake nearby. Everyone wanted quiet. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? They met in Warren just before sunrise on Friday, parking under a faded light outside a diner where the coffee smelled like burnt sugar. The temperature felt crisp, cold enough to fog breath, warm enough to go without gloves. They ate in a booth that rattled when trucks rolled past. The waitress kept calling the group early birds, and the nickname stuck through the morning like a charm. At 7, the town was behind them, the radio lost signal, and the forest swallowed the road. Pines rose in tight ranks as the asphalt dwindled into dirt and the sky thinned into pale silver between branches. They drove the last hour with windows cracked for the pine smell and the sound of gravel under the tires. At 9:40, they turned off onto a narrow logging spur, followed a faded arrow marker, and bumped through standing puddles until a small clearing opened before them. The creek curved around the site like a black ribbon. A mossy boulder stood at the far edge, and birch trees leaned together as if always whispering. The place felt private and older than the dirt road. It felt like a room that had not been used for a long time and yet kept neat. They stepped out, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. Boots scraping, a car door shutting, the zip of canvas. The morning went smoothly, the tents went up facing the water, the lines were tight, the flies clipped down. Priya found a flat place for the cooler. June assembled the stove and made eggs that tasted like smoke and butter. Malik stacked firewood and showed everyone a trick for dry shavings. Nolan strung a blue cord between 2 trees and hung a lantern for later. The sun climbed, a gentle, warm circle above branches. The creek moved without talking. It was the kind of peace people pay for in a city. That early to midday stretch tasted like a promise kept. Around 2, a lone pickup rolled past on the logging road and paused at the clearing entrance. The driver kept the engine idling while he looked at the group. He wore a cap, tugged low, and his profile was angular and sun-emptied. He lifted 2 fingers from the wheel in a small salute, then drove on. The moment was ordinary enough, yet the engine note lingered in the trees long after the truck was gone. Priya laughed and said the man probably knew a better spot. Nolan said all the best spots were secret. Brooke checked the map again and traced a line from the creek to the lakeshore about a quarter-mile north. She wanted to stretch her legs before dinner, and everyone agreed the light would be perfect by 4. They started that walk at 3:52, each with a bottle of water, the trail a faint seam in leaves and needles. The forest smelled darker there, less like pine and more like a cellar. They found the lake in a shallow bowl, the surface still and metallic, catching clouds like dull coins. A thin mist drifted and peeled. In the mud near the waterline, there were shapes, not boot tread. The marks looked long and narrow, with a little crescent at the front. June crouched and pointed. Maybe deer, maybe not. The spacing felt wrong. The stride felt too careful. Priya said it looked like someone dragged a canoe. Brooke said it looked like someone crawled out, and then she laughed because that sounded like the opening line of a bad story told around a fire. Malik took a photo and tucked the worry away, the way people tuck in a shirt they plan to change later. They got back at 5:10. The clearing had changed only by feel. The light had a lower copper tilt, and the shadows had pulled together in the corners of the trees as if the woods were exhaling. They built the fire, and there was a calm, serious joy in the way flame threads rose and caught. Dinner was simple: a skillet of peppers and sausage, a pot of beans, a second pot for water. At 6:30, the fire crackled white and orange. At 7, the birds went softer. At 7:38, the cold steepened, and they put on hats. By 8, the stars switched on in sudden scattered clusters. Everything felt earned. The talk turned to old classes, to cheap apartments, to late-night walks on sidewalks far from this place. Someone joked that if a forest wanted to scare city kids, it would only need to wait until the fire burned low. Everyone laughed, and the laughter sounded warm and full, and the woods held it like a cup. At 9:50, the first odd sound rolled across the water. A single hard splash, not a fish flick, not a rock drop. A heavy body entering with weight. It came from the north side, from the shallow bowl where they had stood in the afternoon. No one moved at first. The fire hissed. Then a second splash, closer. Malik stood and lifted his headlamp. The beam found mist, nothing else. A third splash, farther to the left now, like something changed lanes. Nolan joked that it was a beaver and that beavers worked night shifts. Brooke said beavers do not move like that. Jun said the echo might be odd over still water. Priya said they should save the last of the dry wood because the damp sticks would smoke. At 10:12, a soft whistling drifted through the trees beyond the road. Not a song, not wind and grass. Just 3 notes, rising and falling in a way that felt too deliberate to be shaped by air. It did not sound near or far. It sounded like the woods were carrying it on a shoulder and setting it down among them. The fire snapped, and the 5 looked at each other. No one smiled this time. Nolan said it was probably a hunter walking out late. Malik said night hiking could be dangerous and that nobody whistles at night in a place like this. June sat closer to the fire and wrapped his hands around his knees. Priya tossed a new stick to the flames and said they should call it a night as soon as the water boiled. Brooke checked her watch and said 10:20 is a normal time to get into sleeping bags. The plan felt good because it was a plan. They bedded down at 10:49. The fire was a red bowl. The lantern swung a little in a draft and made the trees look like they moved without moving. The zip of tent doors felt too loud. Nolan and Brooke in one tent. Priya alone in the small green dome she always used. June and Malik sharing a bigger one. The night poured over everything at once, thick and cool. At 11:30, the forest settled into that heavy quiet that makes even a breath sound like a stone thrown into a lake. At 12:07, Nolan woke because the hair on his arms lifted. He heard footfalls not on the road and not on the trail, but on the soft edge of the clearing. Slow, measured, steady, like someone circling to count tents. He held his breath and felt his chest sting. Brooke lay still. The steps past his door, faded, returned on the other side. He whispered that it was probably a deer. He stopped speaking because a pale oval moved across the tent wall, as if a face passed inches away. There was no outline of a nose, there were no eyes, just a smooth stain of lighter dark sliding by. He pressed his teeth together and did not move again. At 12:40, Malik heard it too. The steps were careful and almost patient. They stopped, then a soft dragging sound, then steps again. He touched June on the shoulder, and June nodded without opening his eyes. At 1:03, the whistling returned. The same 3 notes, now shaped like a call and answer. One set from the road, one from the creek, one from the black line of trees beyond the fire ring. Priya sat up in her tent and placed her palms on the floor like she could feel the vibration. She whispered her own name as if to hold herself inside it. The notes fell quiet. Her heart did not. At 1:30, a cry lilted across the clearing, a voice that sounded soaked, thin, and cold. It asked for help without forming a real request. It carried the shape of a plea without words. It sounded like a person, and also like a tape someone had warped. Nolan unzipped an inch of the tent and looked out. Nothing but mist and a darker dark where the creek pooled. Malik unzipped as well, and his headlamp clipped the edge of a birch. The bark looked wet like a shed skin. No eyes glowed. No bodies fled. The cry came again. From the road this time, then from the lake, then from behind his tent. The distance felt wrong each time, like it measured something that was not space. At 2, they gathered by the ember bowl of the fire and fed it just enough to make light. No one said much, breath plumed white, the lantern hummed, the whistling settled into the low trees and paced them. Brooke gripped the handle of the camp hatchet without swinging it. Priya held a long flashlight with both hands like it could double as a baton. June stood with one boot half unlaced. Malik took a deep breath and called out that they did not want trouble. The syllables fell down right where he stood, like they had weight. Nothing answered. The water shifted. The mist leaned across the ground like a fog tide. By 3, the sound slowed, as if whatever moved had lost interest. The friends returned to their tents with the brittle pride of people who had endured something and could now insist it was nothing. Sleep came in frightened scraps when the first bleached version of sunrise slid under the treetops at 5:56. The relief tasted like clean water. They made coffee the way survivors make coffee, hands shaking, laughter a notch too loud. Daylight pushed the night backward into the tree line. It felt like being forgiven. Then they found the prints. By 7:10, the light was strong enough to peel mist off the lake, and there in the gray sand lay a sequence of marks that did not fit anything they knew. Long impressions, narrow at the front, widening mid-length, with faint lines that curved like ridges. They ran from the water to the tree line and back again. The stride was long. The path was an arc that circled the clearing twice. At one point, the marks crossed themselves in a way that suggested something had paused, crouched, and then stood. Malik measured one with his hand and said the length ran from thumb to elbow. June squinted and said it looked like something with webbed hands had walked on its fingers. Brooke said that was not how animals move. Priya said this was a bad idea made real and that they needed to leave. The vote came fast. Pack, drive out, breakfast on the road. They started at 7:31, trying to move calmly while moving fast. The tents came down in practice motions, yet the air felt wrong, as if the clearing were holding its breath. Malik reached for the lantern rope, and a wind that did not touch any leaves pushed across his neck. Nolan turned toward the creek and saw circles of ripples building where nothing had broken the surface. Brooke cinched the last strap on her pack and whispered that she could feel pressure in her ears. Priya tried her car first. The engine turned once and stopped. She tried again. Nothing but a heavy click. Jun tried his. Same click. Malik tried his. Dead. At 8:19, the whistling began again. Softer now, farther away, like the woods were practicing. Then the notes changed, lowering as if someone were walking toward a deeper room. Nolan grabbed the hatchet. Malik took the heavy flashlight. They agreed to walk the road south until they found a ridge with a phone signal. Brooke and Priya would stay with the gear and try to coax power from the portable battery. June would check the fuses. They drew a line of logic, like chalk, bright, and hopeful. The south road ran along the creek and then cut up. After 10 minutes, the trees closed in and the air cooled by several degrees. At 8:49, they found the first of the old timber signs nailed to a trunk. The letters were gouged and faded. The words said no overnight use. The one below said day use only. The one below that said water level unstable. It felt like a warning whispered after the door already shut. Nolan said they did not stay by the lake, and Malik said the creek connects to the lake anyway, and that water does not respect little sign. The whistling drifted again, but now it came from ahead and behind at the same time. Nolan slowed. Malik said they should mark the trail. He tied a red bandana to a low branch and felt stupid doing it, then felt worse for not doing it sooner. At 9:12, the smell changed. Less pine, more iron. They crested a rise and saw the old iron bridge that crossed the creek where the water narrowed. The deck was banged up and patched with plywood. On the near side, something had scratched the railing with the head of a nail. Rows of tall, thin marks, grouped in threes, dragging down to the ground like someone had been bored and patient at the same time. They walked past slowly. The bridge hummed under their weight. The creek moved under them in black sliding planes. Aliquot waves licked the stones. Mid-span, Nolan looked down and saw his own face bent by the water, and then beside it, another pale oval drifting up from deeper than a person could stand. He stepped back too fast, his heel clanged against the rail, and the sound went into the trees like a thrown coin. They made it to the ridge at 9:48 and found a bar of service on Malik's phone. He dialed the ranger station number Brooke had written on a torn map corner. It rang twice and cut out. He tried again. A voicemail webbed across the line, the words too slow. He asked for help at Kinzua Creek and said they could not get their vehicles to start. He gave the coordinates the way his hand would give away secrets when it shook. Then he held the phone in the air as if that could push the message forward. He hit send. The screen blinked. The bar of service disappeared like a boy learning a magic trick. After that, the phone refused to light. They returned at 10:30, moving faster now. The clearing looked exactly the same and entirely different. The gear lay where they left it, but the cooler lid was open, though the latch was engaged. A line of wet silt lay across the ground in a curve like a resting body had left its outline. Brooke and Priya stood by the dead cars with their hands pressed flat against the hoods as if listening. June knelt by a battery with the case open and a set of fuses fanned on the ground like cards. Priya said the walk had taken too long. Brooke said a log had knocked against the stones and made them both jump. Her voice had that higher edge people carry when they have crossed from fear into the bright space where fear feels useful. Malik said the call might have gone through. The words felt weak while still true. They tried to eat at 11 because eating proves a day is normal. The food tasted like something stored in a basement that does not want to be a home. The forest had that noon silence that falls heavy on thin places. At 1, the sky turned white and then deeper gray. Nolan sharpened the hatchet with small strokes because motion felt better than stillness. Priya laid out the map and traced a route that would cut across to an old service road by late afternoon. Brooke argued they should not split again. June whispered that he could hear water under the ground as if the creek was also above them. Malik said everyone would stay together if they walked, and the rule felt like a rope. At 2, the light began to behave like late day. It was not late day. It only looked like it. Clouds slid in without wind. The whistling did not come back. The relief made them feel bold in the wrong way. They decided to move. Backpacks on, lantern stuffed into the top of a bag, a single car key in each pocket because superstition sometimes gets promoted to policy. They stepped onto the trail at 2:20 and felt that strange tilt of land found in old saloons and strange hallways. The forest was not flat. The forest was not honest either. They did not make it to the service road. At 3, the trail vanished without warning in a stand of young pines. The needle floor pressed smooth like a swept church. They spread out to find the worn line again, calling names in low voices. Malik called for Priya and heard his voice return from the right, though he had spoken to the left. Nolan called for Brooke and heard the name slide away as if the trees were carrying it. June said he saw the blue flash of the lantern cord. He did not. He saw a strip of something bright hanging from a lower branch, and when he reached it, he found his own red bandana tied tight, smelling faintly of his pocket and something muddy. They had looped back without a corner in the path. At 3:30, they were in the clearing again, though. None of them had turned their bodies. It was as if the clearing had stepped forward to greet them. The fire ring sat black and clean. The cars hunched. The lake beyond the trees lifted mist that now lay across the ground in thin belts. Brooke started to cry and did not apologize. Malik pressed his palms to his eyes and counted to 10. Nolan said they would make a bigger fire before dark, and the work would keep their minds steady. Priya sat on her pack and listened for the whistling. The silence was worse. They built the tallest legal fire and then built it taller. At 5:10, flames jumped high enough to paint the birch trunks gold. At 5:40, something moved in that painted world at the edge of the light. Not a person, not a deer. Tall and thin as a drawn line, it shifted between 2 trees and seemed to bend when it did not bend. The shape stopped. Then a second shape crossed behind it in the other direction. Nolan went still in a way that makes animals forget there is meat in you. June whispered that if they made noise, it might announce them. Brooke whispered that silence had already done that job. At 6, the crying came back. That same soaked and thin sound. It asked for help from the road, then from the creek, then from beside the lantern rope. They stood together because loneliness would have ended them. The fire felt like a fragile wall. The voices drew close, then stopped, as if testing their own boundaries. Malik lifted the heavy flashlight and said with complete calm that they would hold this line until dawn. He said it loudly enough to convince his own nerves that they could obey him. At 7, the mist thickened. It rose from the creek and slid along the ground at knee height, seeping into the clearing rather than blowing in. It smelled like coins and old wood. The firelight turned it into a living thing. The shapes at the edge of the trees stepped nearer, then paused,